You found your way back here, to where the boundary between reality and nightmares blurs. Get comfortable. Tonight's horror stories might just keep you up all night. Very few people experience something so traumatizing at a young age that it sticks with them forever. I'm one of those people. I was maybe 6 or 7 years old. My older brother and I grew up in a broken household. Our mom raised us. Our dad was a deadbeat and disappeared out of our lives. Our mom worked 2 jobs to provide for us. She'd sometimes have to work night shifts and would usually have our grandma stay at the house on nights that she had to work. My brother Chump is 2 years older than me. We were fortunate enough to have our own bedrooms given the circumstances. We lived in a small house, but for the 3 of us and on our mom's dime alone, it wasn't terrible. The area in which we lived wasn't amazing, though. It was a night like any other. I can't remember if it was a school night or if it was a weekend. I don't remember any tiny details like that, but what I do remember is I was in the living room with my grandma. My grandma was watching TV, and I was playing with Legos on my Lego table. I was being loud and making a mess with them because I remember my grandma kept saying, "Rock, quiet down." Chump was already in bed. My bedtime was 9:30, given that it was probably approaching that time. I'm guessing this was a weekend night, otherwise, my bedtime would have been earlier. The layout of the house was simple. Living room, dining room, and kitchen are all connected, and then there was a hallway which led to the bathroom and 3 bedrooms. Our mom's bedroom was at the end of the hall, mine was in the middle. Our grandma would sleep in our mom's bed when she'd stay over to watch us. Eventually, I had to go to sleep. My grandma would always go to sleep early too, so right after saying good night to me, she would go to the bathroom to brush her teeth and stuff before going to sleep as well. I was never one to be afraid of the dark or anything. My mom says I used to be a really brave child. But that night, I woke up in the middle of the night, something unusual for me because I remember myself being a very heavy sleeper. I heard something outside in the hallway, creaks in the floor. The wood floors in that house were always very creaky. Anytime someone walked down the hall, you'd hear it. I thought my grandma was going to the bathroom. However, the creaking didn't stop. It sounded like the creaks were moving back and forth. I got out of bed and went to the door to listen. Now, I heard whispering. I was more confused than anything. I thought my grandma was talking to Chump. I opened the door and looked into the hallway, and what I saw still haunts me. There was a tall, naked, skinny woman leaning on the wall with her head between her arms. She was whispering stuff to herself, and then, like a deer in headlights, her head whipped around to look at me. I screamed for my grandma like a little girl and slammed my door shut. There were pounds on my door, and the woman on the other side was screaming a name, "Bonnie, Bonnie, open the door." I kept screaming as loud as I could for my grandma, and I heard her scream in the hallway. I distinctly remember my grandma screaming, "Get the out of here." The woman screamed, "Where is Bonnie?" My grandma was in her mid-60s at the time, and she was still pretty quick. She yelled at me to keep my door locked, and she managed to fend off this crazy woman as she also called the police at the same time. I don't know how she did it, but my grandma was one tough woman. The woman left the house screaming "Bonnie," and after locking the door, my grandma came to hug both me and Chump, who was awake and also crying from the commotion. We all sat huddled together until the police came. By that time, my grandma told us to just go back to sleep. This simply was a matter of my grandma not locking one of the doors, mixed with living in an already shady area. That woman had to be on crack or something. Seeing what I saw at such a young age did a number on me. I couldn't sleep alone for a long time. It was this incident that really resulted in us moving out of that house not long after. Around 8 years ago, I moved out of my mom's house into my first apartment in the city of Chicago. The place was a nice 3-bedroom apartment on the south side of the city in a friendly neighborhood by the University of Illinois. I lived with 2 roommates, Patrick and Kelsey. Kelsey was a good friend of mine, while Patrick was a good friend of Kelsey's who I had not met prior, although we ended up getting along just fine. One night, about a month after moving in, I met up with a few friends of mine for drinks at a bar more in the center of the city, around 15 minutes from my place. It was a good time, and I ended up getting slightly drunk before getting into a cab at 1 a.m. and heading home. Upon walking into my apartment, I noticed that Patrick's door was open, showing that he was staying at his girlfriend's place, while Kelsey's door was closed with the light from his TV shining underneath the crack. I made my way to my bedroom and put on my own TV before lying down to prepare for sleep. After around 10 minutes, I heard my doorbell ring. Half asleep, I woke up, confused as it was 1:30 in the morning, so I ignored it. A few seconds later, the doorbell rang again, and then again a few seconds after that. It's important to mention that my roommate Kelsey had a good amount of side cash by dealing weed to a few people. He was also a huge stoner himself, so the idea that he fell asleep while waiting for a late-night customer to come over was not out of the realm of possibility. With this in mind, I went over to my intercom and asked who was there. A girl's voice answered back, "It's Kaylee." "I'm here to see Kelsey." Thinking that my suspicions had been confirmed, I exited out of my front door and headed down the stairs. The door to the outside of our apartment building was made of tall glass, so you could easily identify any potential visitors. Here, I saw an attractive college-age blonde girl with glasses waiting patiently outside. I had never seen this person before, however, she appeared to be non-threatening. Besides having random customers over to grab weed, Kelsey would also have some random girls over to hook up with from time to time. Because of this, I let my guard down slightly and cracked the door open. The girl then repeated what she had said moments earlier over the intercom, "Hi, I'm here to see Kelsey." I replied, "Okay, he's here. Just follow me up," and I held the door open for her. She grabbed the handle, and I turned around to head back up the stairs. As I was walking back up, I quickly noticed that this Kaylee girl was not following me up. I glanced over my shoulder and saw that she was still standing outside holding the door open, only now she was staring off to her right, almost as if waiting for someone. At this moment, a tidal wave of fear crashed over me as I realized something horrible was more than likely about to happen. I continued walking up to my place, quicker now. After turning the corner of the stairs, I heard the door swing open and then heavy footsteps running up the stairs behind me. I looked over my shoulder again, and what I saw shook me to my core. A tall, gangly man with sunken-in eyes and greasy long hair down to his shoulders was running up the stairs straight at me. He was wearing a sleeveless black t-shirt, and apart from the cheap-looking tribal tattoos I saw creeping up his arms, I noticed he was also holding what looked like a lead pipe in his right hand. At this moment, my body shot full of adrenaline as I turned around and raced back up the stairs and into my apartment. I turned around to close the door and saw the man, who was now only a few feet from entering my apartment, the pipe over his head. With less than a second to spare, I slammed the door and locked it in one swift motion. Immediately after, I heard the thud of the pipe hit my door. I stood facing the now closed door, paralyzed, as the man hit the door 3 more times while shouting obscenities at me. He eventually gave up and ran down the stairs and out the front door. I ran into Kelsey's room to wake him up. After telling him what exactly had just gone down, he responded by telling me that, yes, he knew a blonde girl named Kaylee, only he had just met her earlier the same day. Apparently, while I was out with my friends, the doorbell rang while Kelsey was home alone. Instead of going down to let her in himself, Kelsey buzzed her up after just hearing her name, thinking she was a friend of mine. When she reached the door to our unit, he opened it and let her in. He said it seemed like she was confused, mentioning that she was looking for someone named Felix. Kelsey responded by saying his own name and that no one named Felix lived here. He mentioned she stayed near the entrance of the unit and kept reaching behind her to make sure the doors stayed open before leaving only a few moments later. After hearing this, my theory is that these same people came earlier in the day and, not expecting to have someone just let them up through the buzzer, the girl made the mistake of forgetting to keep the door to the building open, rendering the attacker unable to enter during this first attempt. Either way, we both got extremely lucky that night. We did call the police, who arrived and asked for more information about what happened. They asked if there was anyone we knew who might want to do us harm, and we answered no, which was the truth, as this seemed to be a completely random attack. The cops left soon after, saying that there was nothing much they could do. We never saw that Kaylee girl or her scumbag partner again. Let me give you some context before the story begins. When I was 18 years old, I lived a pretty normal life. I had just finished high school the year before the story takes place. I had always been one for horror, anything, whether it was movies, games, jump scares, you name it, and I loved it. I never seemed to be afraid of anything, and I loved that it allowed me to go and do things that made me appear tougher to girls who I was interested in at the time or who were interested in me. I thought of it almost like a superpower. My friend had always talked about this REM-induced real-life nightmare called sleep paralysis. I, however, had never experienced such a thing. My friend Ellie suffered from extreme lucid dreaming. She explained to me several times about how certain stimulators or outside factors could play into her dreams and mold them into what could potentially be a heavenly experience full of fun and wonder, or could just as easily turn into a bone-chilling nightmare straight out of hell. Being the light sleeper I am, I saw no chance of it occurring, so I kind of just let it go right over my head. One night, Ellie texted me and asked me to come over as she had just suffered another so-called evil experience due to her sleep condition. When I arrived, I found her asleep again, seemingly peacefully. I took a seat on her stool that she had for her makeup dresser right by the window and started playing a game on my phone. 30 minutes or so went by, and I figured she was peacefully asleep and it would probably be okay for me to leave as long as I let her know that I stopped by as she requested. But suddenly, Ellie awoke and started screaming. This was a different kind of scream, though, a type of scream I had never heard before, especially from her. It was almost mumbled, I don't know how else to describe it. Her eyes bulged open, and I ran over to her side. I asked her if she was having a bad dream. She started shaking. I grabbed a hold of her to try to calm her down, but the tremors grew. I asked her what was going on, but no response. I figured this was just another one of her so-called sleep paralysis episodes. I did my best to comfort her. After about 40 or so seconds went by, she regained full control of her body. I made sure she was okay and then left to go back to my house, as it was almost 2 o'clock in the morning. Right as I got home, I received a very panicked text reading, "The hallucinations won't stop." I asked her to clarify what she meant, but no response. After about 20 minutes went by, I took it upon myself to head back over to her place. When I arrived, I noticed the illumination of red and blue covering her front porch and the surrounding road signs. I ran up to her house, desperately trying to find out what happened. As I approached the house, I noticed Ellie was speaking with one of the officers on the scene. When I went up to talk to her, Ellie and the officer walked me over to a more secluded area. What I found out still sends chills up my spine to this day. Apparently, when I had gone over to Ellie's that night, she wasn't asleep at all, she was pretending to be. Evidently, right behind me was a tall, skinny homeless man hiding in her closet. The police had also found a very large kitchen knife on him as well. The theory to this day is Ellie thought she was having an episode when, in reality, this very real man was quietly creeping towards her in her bedroom. Supposedly, when I had entered her house, it was enough to spook the man into hiding, and my presence was enough to keep him hidden. This gave Ellie the time to call 911 and report the situation, which in turn resulted in the police arriving almost immediately after I had left. Thankfully, the man was taken into custody rather quickly. To this day, I don't know what to think about that night, other than that I could have very easily saved her life simply by keeping her company during what I thought was a very stressful situation. This, in turn, could have resulted in some very scary and heinous acts that would have taken place if I had been there any later. I hope I never experience such a thing. That would be what finally trips my fear factor without a doubt. My family and I used to go camping all the time, sometimes more than 3 or 4 times a year, even. We were camping in White Mountain National Forest, and it was our first time doing a more primitive type of camp. Usually, we went to traditional campsites like Yogi Bear Jellystone or even KOA, but this time we were in for something different. I wasn't that excited for it because I didn't think it would be as fun. I think I was 14 when this happened, around that age at least. I was still in an angsty teenage phase, if you will. I was still a good kid, just a little emotional and rough around the edges. When we got there, while my parents were setting up, my little brother and I wanted to do some exploring. We walked around for a while, but we didn't go too far as we didn't know the area and we didn't want to get lost or stray too far from camp. We talked about anything you would imagine 2 unsupervised children would talk about. I started messing with my little brother, Blair, saying things like we were lost and to watch out for the bears and the monsters. Pretty crappy, I know, but I thought it was funny. We messed with each other like that all the time, but I could tell he was actually starting to get scared, so I let him know I was only joking. I was hoping to find a cool bank offshore, like a place we could swim or fish. I found the perfect spot. He ran over to it to investigate it, and I fell in love with the scenery. It truly was beautiful. Our little kid brains loved every second of the outdoors. I knew we had been gone a while, though, and I was in charge of my brother, and I didn't want us to get in trouble. Mom wanted us back before dark anyway, and we were starting to lose daylight. So, we walked back to camp, had dinner, and did our nightly ritual with the family, like playing board games. We had a campfire and all that fun stuff until eventually, it was time for bed. Blair and I were staying in our own tent, while our mom and dad had their own as well. We got our sleeping bags, a lantern, and not much of anything else, maybe some snacks that we snuck into our tent and a DVD player to watch a movie. I fell asleep, but I remember waking up for seemingly no reason in a groggy state of mind. I turned over towards Blair and noticed he was gone. I instantly shot up. I walked out of the tent and saw him walking towards the trail that we came from earlier. "Blair, what are you doing?" I asked. Get back to sleep before Dad finds out what you're doing. That was when I heard a noise coming from my parents' tent. I worried that I woke them up by basically yelling. I don't know how Blair got out of the tent without me noticing in the first place, but he kept walking until eventually he was out of my sight. I ended up finding him off the trail a ways, thanks to my lantern, and he was sitting by the lake. I grabbed him by the arm and yanked him towards camp when all of a sudden we saw a shadow. It was a man, and there was something really wrong with him. Like, seriously. He wasn't only just being a creep by staring at us, but he was clearly deranged. He was standing in the moonlight, and I could see him semi-clearly. He had long, dark hair that looked greasy and a creepy mustache. He also had some sort of tool in his hand that looked like a hammer. The way he was just standing there, all crusty looking and staring intensely, showed me enough. He was just sitting there, mouth breathing, and he was extremely pale. He looked like he hadn't showered in weeks. I didn't stay for another second or even bother to say a word to him. I mean, come on, I was pretty sure he was a murderer. Now the chase was on. Blair wasn't as fast as me and he could barely keep up. Keep in mind, he was only 9 or 10, so his little legs could only go so fast. I grabbed his arm and practically dragged him to make him go faster. The other problem that we had was we had to get past this man to get back to camp, so we legit had to make a detour and run in a circle around him. I don't know what we would have done if it wasn't dark or if we weren't already close to home. We were pretty sure that we lost him and eventually met up with Mom and Dad. They found us out a ways from camp. I guess we were heading in the wrong direction. We kind of got lost in the panic, I guess. You'll never guess what happened after that. When we arrived back at camp, my dad's truck was gone, the only vehicle that we had out there. That man baited us off camp and he stole the truck, broke into our tents, and stole my dad's wallet and phone. Luckily, we had a walkie-talkie to call for help. The police found my dad's truck and actually arrested the man a few days later. What if we would have been out further into the woods that night? That man would have been out further into the woods that night. That man would have caught us, no doubt about it. He chased us through the woods and tried to murder us or kidnap us, one of the two. When my dad got the truck back, unfortunately, it was totaled in a drunk driving incident by the man that stole it. Man, that trip was a nightmare. It all started on a rainy night. My dad had wanted me to babysit my little brothers while he went to the bar to play pool and drink. I'd gotten them to settle down for the night and I decided to go order some food and chill, playing some CS while I waited. About 30 minutes had gone by and I was wondering why the hell my food was taking so long. I finally heard a knock on my door and there was a rough-looking man who said he had my food. I tipped him and he went on his way. I closed the door and walked back to my computer, completely forgetting to lock it. If one of my protective friends hadn't said something while we were gaming, things might have gone a lot worse. Them asking to make sure I locked the door was a potential life-saving question, because in fact, I had completely forgotten to lock the door. To me, it wasn't the biggest deal at the time, but I'm glad they said something and you'll see why here in a minute. I checked on the door to make sure it was locked, and of course, it wasn't. So I locked the door real quick and went back to gaming. My computer, by the way, was in my living room, and to the right of me was my kitchen. In the kitchen, there was a giant bay window facing directly into where I was sitting and gaming. I started eating my food while gaming, and I heard my front door knob jiggle. I thought maybe I was just scared and hallucinating it since I was home alone and my brothers were asleep in bed, until my dog started barking at the front door. That was the exact moment I realized that something bad was happening. Whoever was there started banging and rattling the door handle. Freaked out, I ducked under the counter beside me, called my dad, and then called 911. While I was on the phone, my little brothers ran out of their room screaming that someone was standing outside their bedroom window, pointing towards the lock, and smiling and waving at them, trying to get them to open it for him. I completely lost it and started crying, but I had to hide my brothers in my room, in my closet, and I told them to not come out at all. I thought he was going to try the back door next, which was a glass door that he could have easily rocked back and forth to get the lock loose or even just shattered the door completely. All it would really take to break it was an object to swing at it, like a metal bat or something. So I was freaking out. I grabbed a knife and waited for my dad and the police to show up for what felt like forever. I was scared that I was going to have to defend my little brothers and myself in a life or death scenario. I was only 13 at the time, so I was really scared. The cops finally showed up and the person had disappeared. But every night after that, I was scared he would come back and we would finally meet. I have no idea if it was someone random or the Chinese food delivery driver from earlier. I just hoped he would never come back. Luckily, he never did, but that didn't stop me from being scared shitless every night, especially when I was home alone. It's especially creepy when you think about how us kids were alone. I think he knew that and he was trying to prey on us, but luckily he gave up. Hopefully, he heard me calling the police or something, and that's why he ran. I guess we'll never really know for sure. I work overnight at a warehouse a few miles out from my home. My schedule varies depending on the day, but I'm usually home between 4 and 6 in the morning. I was driving home from my exhausting shift, and all I could think about was getting in bed and passing out. I wasn't falling asleep behind the wheel, but I definitely wasn't fully awake either. I parked on the street in front of my house, walked in through the front door, then walked upstairs and fell into bed. It was one of those days where it just felt so good to be laying down. I was asleep in minutes. When I woke up, I was just as tired, if not more so. I wasn't even sure why I'd woken up in the first place. I rolled over and looked out the window, and it was still dark out, so it had to have been less than an hour since I got in bed. As I began to roll back over to sleep again, I noticed something that made me stop. My bedroom door was open. I stared at it for a good couple of seconds, just so confused by it. I never sleep with my door open. It always makes me feel uncomfortable. Coming home that day was a blur, though, so I couldn't actually remember closing the door, but it was just one of those things I knew I'd always do no matter what. I got up slowly and walked across the room. All the lights were off in the house, but I looked down the hallway outside my room as I closed the door. The second the door clicked, a sound came from the other side of the house. I don't know how to describe it, but it was like something moving for just a couple of seconds, then it stopped. My whole body froze, and I stood there for a minute listening for anything else. The silence was deafening now and only freaked me out more. I took a deep breath and opened the door again. In my head, I still didn't believe this was anything real. I was sure this was just me being scared over nothing, but I still wanted to check just to keep me from overthinking it. I walked across the hallway to the second bedroom, which was where I thought the sound had come from. The room only had a dresser and a bed in it, so there wasn't much to look around. I didn't see anything, so I started walking back until I heard a door in the hallway creaking open. I leaned over and saw a man stepping out of the closet between me and my bedroom. He was looking at me, and in that moment that we made eye contact, I recognized him. I quickly closed and locked the door to the room I was in, and I heard him run down the stairs and out of the house. Of course, I called 911 as soon as I was safe to go back to my room. The police said there were no signs of forced entry, so they said I must have left the front door unlocked. Again, I know I was tired, but that's just something I always do unconsciously, so I don't know if I can believe it. What scares me is that I know I had seen that man from somewhere before, but I have no idea where or when. It could have just been at the grocery store or walking through the city, but it all seems too coincidental. Also, I don't know how long he was inside my house for, but nothing was taken. I know he was likely the one to open my bedroom door while I was sleeping, though, which makes me really uneasy to even think about. He could have done anything or taken anything, but he didn't. Maybe when he opened my bedroom door, he recognized me too and decided not to do what he planned once he saw it was my house. It's all too hard to say, but I've been thinking about it non-stop for a while now, and I'm still paranoid. This happened in August of last year. I had taken a week off from work for a staycation at home. I had been living alone for the past few months after my roommate moved out, but I'd been working too much to really enjoy the space and freedom of living alone. This week was supposed to be my relaxing me time that I never got to have. Unfortunately, it could not have been further from that. It was my second day off, and I was just chilling, watching TV, eating nice home-cooked meals, all of that kind of stuff, when I heard someone walk up to my front porch. It was midday, so I thought maybe the mailman or just some solicitor. But as I stayed sitting on the couch for a few minutes, I realized they still hadn't knocked or rang the doorbell. I never heard them walk away, so it got me curious. I got up and went over to the door to look out the peephole. Sure enough, someone was still on my porch. It was a man looking to be in his mid-30s, wearing a light sweatshirt and black jeans. He wasn't in front of the door, though. He was off to the side, looking around like he was searching for something. I thought of opening the door, but I was too nervous to confront him, so I just watched. After 40 seconds, the guy walked away quickly and got into a parked car on the road by my neighbor's house. Once I saw him drive away, I went out to investigate. Everything looked normal to me, at least everything in the area the man was looking around. I went back inside and mostly forgot about it. Within the hour, I took a nap, then made dinner a few hours later, and finally turned on a movie to finish off the night with. Sometime in the middle of it, there was a knock at the door. I paused the movie and went to see who it was. It was that man from earlier, this time standing in front of the door and seeming to be waiting for me to answer. I cracked the door open just enough to talk through. "Hey, I was hoping you'd help me out with something." I'd ask someone else, but nobody would answer, the man said right away with a big smile. "What do you need?" I asked. He went on to tell me this elaborate story about his car. Breaking down right next to my house, he pointed at it, and I immediately knew it was the same car I saw him drive away in earlier. Then he said all he needed was to use my phone to make a quick call. Knowing this was some sort of scam or something, I denied him right away and closed the door. I then looked through the peephole to make sure he left, but he didn't. His face grew excessively angry, and he banged on the door again. I yelled through the door that I'd call the cops if he didn't leave. He stood and thought for a moment, then hurried off, but not to his car. He walked around to the left side of the house. Fearing this was going to escalate, I dialed 911 and told them about the situation. Thank God I did, because not even a minute later, a sudden crash came from the dining room. I ran over to see what it was and saw that he'd smashed the window and was crawling through it. I tried to run for the garage to get in my car, but the man was quick, chasing me down half the house before grabbing me and holding me still. I fought back, kicking and punching, but he completely overpowered me. He told me through his clenched jaw to be quiet and insisted that I stop fighting while he dragged me to the front door and opened it. Once I knew what he was doing, I only started fighting harder. As he tried to bring me closer to his car, someone walking their dog on the other side of the road saw us and came running over. Before he even reached us, the man let go of me and sprinted to his car and drove away. It all happened so fast. Once the police arrived, they helped calm me down and got all the information I could give them. Apparently, it wasn't enough, though. He was never found. What's creepier is that the police think the first time I saw him come by wasn't actually his first time. They think I may have caught him collecting some sort of camera or mic he'd set up on my house to spy on me. He hasn't been back that I know of, but I plan to move out anyway just to be safe. Whatever his plan was, I don't want to risk finding out. I live in a townhome in the middle of a relatively small city. It's very small and outdated, but I live alone, so it's the best I can afford. I worked late this night, getting home sometime around 8 or 9. Pulling up my shared driveway, I noticed the townhome connected to mine had its front door wide open. All the lights in the house were off, though, which made me think they must have accidentally left it open and then gone to sleep. I made fun of them in my head and went inside my house, not thinking much else about it. I got out some frosted flakes and ate while watching Netflix, then forced myself to go to bed because I had to be up early for my morning shift tomorrow. Going to my bedroom, which happened to have a connecting wall to my neighbors, I heard a few thumps come from inside their place. My neighbors usually don't make any noise, so hearing anything from them was a rare occurrence. I just hoped they wouldn't keep me up and turned off the lights and hopped in bed. I laid there with my eyes closed for several minutes, trying to drift into sleep when the most terrifying sound instantly shook me up, my front door being smashed in. It was a single violent hit. I jumped out of bed and ran into the hallway. There was wood debris all over the floor, and the front door was wide open. But whoever did it must have been moving quickly because they weren't there. I heard some footsteps running through the living room, and at this point, I could tell there was more than one person. I tried to run back to my bedroom, but a man screamed at me to stop. I turned to face two large men, both wearing masks and hoodies. One was holding a baseball bat, and the other held some sort of metal ramming tool, which must have been used to bust open the door. This next part was chaotic as they yelled commands at me and forced me to the ground. I didn't even try to fight back because I knew it would only put me in more danger. One of them held me down aggressively, pressing my head on the floor, while the other went around the house and shoved stuff in his backpack. I was panicking, breathing heavily, and trying to convince them to get off me and just let me stay out of their way. I probably should have just shut up and stayed quiet, but it was hard to think straight. Somewhere around 2 to 3 minutes in, the man that was grabbing stuff came running back to the hallway, yelling at me and the other guy about something outside. The man got off me and ran over to the window. Then they both came running back and pushed me down as I was trying to get up. They looked full of rage as they started attacking and threatening me before trying to run out the back door, but they were too late. For cops had surrounded the house, and seconds later, they forced the men to give up. As it turns out, the men broke into my neighbor's townhome too. They weren't home at the time, but when they pulled in, they immediately called the cops, which was how they were able to help me. The two men turned out to be just regular guys trying to make some quick money. Aside from the smashed front door and a few bruises, I was all right. I still think it was stupid of them to attack me instead of just making a run for it at the end, but I'm sure either way they were screwed. It was by far the most terrifying thing I'd ever been through, but I'm extremely lucky to have had it end up the way it did, with them in prison. This happened years ago when I was 20. Back then, I was good friends with a guy named Ethan, who I met in high school. Both of us grew up with a passion for the outdoors, and so we thought it'd be fun to go on a week-long backpacking trip in the California woods together. We've done this once before, and I really enjoyed it. I remember looking forward to it. The whole trip started off going well, but that only lasted till the second night. It was just starting to get dark, and Ethan and I were setting up our tents for the night when we began to hear the distant sound of leaves crunching under multiple pairs of footsteps. We were pretty deep in the forest, but running into other campers wasn't completely unheard of, just, I guess, a bit of a rare occurrence. Eventually, 3 guys came into view. They didn't really look like campers. They didn't have backpacks or anything. I thought it was kind of weird to be wandering around the forest this late, but I didn't think much of it. They gave us a somewhat friendly greeting, and we gave one back. They then asked us if we were camping for the night, which was obvious as we were in the process of setting up our tents with the rest of our stuff all laid out. We pointedly said yes and asked if that was a problem. We wanted to make sure we weren't on someone's private property or, just generally in a place we weren't supposed to be. They replied saying no and just kind of walked off. The whole encounter was odd, but Ethan didn't think so. He pointed out how they were most likely just hunters in the area, as all of them were armed, something I myself didn't notice. Got to a few hours later, and Ethan and I were now asleep in our respective tents. This was around the time I woke up to the sound of yelling, like multiple voices shouting in the distance. I yelled out to Ethan to see if he was awake. He was and was just as confused as I was. It was 2 a.m. when this happened. Our conversation was then interrupted by multiple gunshots. They honestly sounded like they were getting closer. I asked Ethan if he thought that whoever these people were just hunting. He responded, saying, "No, dude, there's no way they're hunting this late. I think we should go." My heart started to race, now realizing the reality of the situation we were in. We both unzipped our tents, grabbed only our bare necessities, and started hastily moving west. We moved for maybe half an hour before stopping. The yelling and gunshots were now barely audible, although they were persistent, continuing off and on up until sunrise. All night, we basically just sat there, listening to them, both wide awake from a mixture of fear and adrenaline. When the sun finally rose, we discussed what to do next. Ultimately, we decided we would wait until noon before heading back to our campsite. The plan was to then quickly pack up all of our stuff and make the trek back to our cars, cutting our trip 5 days short. Fast forward to noon, and we started cautiously heading back. When we arrived, the sight we were met with was nothing short of horrifying. Our campsite had been completely ransacked. Almost all of our stuff had been damaged. This is thousands of dollars in equipment we're talking about. But most disturbing were the bullet holes shot into our tents. You don't have to be that smart to conclude that these people had genuinely tried to kill us. Further supporting this theory is the fact that nothing was actually stolen from our campsite, it was all just damaged. As far as who did this, we don't know. The only people we can really pin as suspects are the 3 people that walked up to us as we were building our tents. But this begs the question, why? Why would they do this? The whole experience has left us with more questions than answers. Nothing about it makes much sense, but I know I myself just feel lucky to be alive. In the end, we quickly salvaged all the equipment we could and made the trek back to our cars. In 2014, a man named Blair and his wife Farah were spending a weekend together on Vancouver Island, which they had done many times before. The couple has a lot of experience on the island and just camping in general. Vancouver Island provides an optimal camping setting because of its mix of scenic beaches and dense forest. The couple had many successful camping trips on the island until something truly terrifying happened to them on their final outing on the island. Blair and Farah were far from any roads or civilization, enjoying the solitude. They set up camp on a beach, a good distance from anywhere, and kept a fire going. To get to the trail leaving the beach was 1 kilometer along the beach and 2 kilometers to the road through the forest. The couple had met another camper named Claude from New Zealand, who they ran into earlier that day on the beach. Claude was planning on sleeping in his van, which he parked back up on the road. The couple invited him down to the beach for a fire, and the three shared a bottle of wine, talking amongst themselves around the fire. This is where things started to get a little creepy. The sun was starting to go down by this point, and the trio kept hearing what sounded like female voices from behind them in the bushes dividing the beach from the forest. It wasn't too dark out yet, though, so it was still possible that they were just other hikers or campers nearby, or even a group who anchored offshore and the sound was just bouncing in a weird way. All three of them could agree that they were hearing female voices. On that note, it was getting late and a little dark, so Claude said goodbye and set out to hike back to his car before it was too dark. Blair and Farah stayed by their campsite and stoked the fire because Farah was starting to get creeped out by the voices, which continued on into the darkness. It sounded like two female voices speaking, but whatever that was being said was unintelligible. It sounded to the couple like the voices were not far beyond the tree line now. They stayed up very late tending to the fire, and only when the voices had finally stopped did they decide to put out the fire and go to sleep in the tent. Before doing so, the two had scanned the cove with a flashlight several times looking for boats that could have been the source of the talking, but there was nothing in sight. It was around 3 a.m. when they laid down, finally ready to catch some sleep, but about 15 minutes after they laid down, Blair and Farah heard footsteps in the area around their campsite, over by where the fire was. They came from the direction of the bushes toward the inland behind them, a direction that was not traversable by people. The couple lay there hoping it was just a bear or any animal, because the only bears on the island are black bears, which usually are very timid around people. The footsteps went from the fire, then over to the tent, then back into the woods. 5 minutes later, the footsteps came back again to the fire, and now, clear as day, there were two female voices talking gibberish very loudly. Their communication did not resemble any languages known to Blair or Farah, and they seemed to be talking over each other, having what could barely be considered a conversation at full volume in the dead of night, very far away from civilization, without using lights to navigate through the dense brush relatively quietly in a direction that seemed impossible to traverse on foot. The two voices moved from the fire pit area over to the tent, still talking at a loud volume. They stood over the tent talking for a few seconds, then went completely dead silent. They went back into the woods to never be seen or heard again. Blair and Farah lay there completely frozen and afraid for a long time. They woke up around 11 a.m. the next day because of how late they fell asleep. They packed up first thing and never returned. The couple probably made the best decision to remain quiet in the tent, not drawing attention to themselves from whoever or whatever was outside. The following pictures you're about to see were taken by hikers Orly and Dante, who both live in Eagle Mountain, Utah, a small town south of Salt Lake City. For the past few years, they had been exploring forests in search of interesting things, and one day they found it. One day, Orly was hiking in Cedar Fort, just 5 miles south of Salt Lake City. While hiking, she found large amounts of animal bones and piles of junk people had dumped, but things started to get strange when she started coming across strange symbols and animal parts scattered throughout the forest, some of them in weird formations. On September 15th, she decided to bring her friend Dante along with her to show him in person the unusual things she was finding. This time, the two came across something even more disturbing. On the trail, there was a severed deer head and a pentagram surrounded by deer legs, which were not there the first time Orly walked the trail. The sun was going down, and after getting their pictures, they agreed it was time to head back to the car. But the more they walked, they realized they didn't recognize the path they were on. So, the two started looking around for anything that could refresh their memory of where they were. But as it got dark out, the two accepted that they were lost. With nothing but their phone flashlights to navigate, they started getting the feeling they were being watched. As they picked up their pace, the two started to hear the trees and bushes moving at least 20 feet to their right, made more concerning by the fact that there was no wind that night. The two started to panic and hurried onto a trail they found, hoping it would take them back to Orly's car. Just when things couldn't seem to get any worse, Orly and Dante heard a scream so deep and horrific that it sounded neither human nor animal. The two sprinted down the trail, Orly making a conscious effort not to look back, but Dante did. Dante claimed to see a large black figure on the trail behind them, too big to be a human. The two made it to the car by some stroke of luck, losing whatever was chasing them. So, they left the forest and went straight home. Orly has not returned since. All started with a camping trip. Me and my girlfriend, let's just call her Lee, were young and dumb, blissfully unaware of the cosmic curveball life was about to throw our way. Picture this: crisp mountain air, crackling campfire, the Milky Way sprawled across the velvet darkness. Textbook postcard perfect. Except the postcard ripped in half when we woke up the next morning, disoriented, clothes rumpled, and with a gaping hole in our memories where the previous day should have been. We brushed it off as a weird shared dream, a glitch in the matrix, but a niggling unease settled in our gut, a premonition of things to come. Back in the familiar chaos of college life, things got weirder. Lee, normally the picture of health, started experiencing these unexplainable physical oddities, dizzy spells, nausea, heightened sensitivity to light. Then came the bombshell: pregnant. Impossible. She was on the pill religiously. The doctors were as confused as us, their tests revealing nothing out of the ordinary. Yet, as the weeks ticked by, the strangeness intensified. Lee's body became a battleground, her health fluctuating like a runaway roller coaster. One week she'd be glowing, energetic, the next, pale and listless. The baby inside her, meanwhile, seemed to be defying the laws of biology, growing at an alarming rate. The ultrasound session was disturbing. Before Lee and I knew what we were looking at, the technician ended the session. She seemed disturbed, leaving with no explanations given. Both Lee and I were beyond bewildered, bordering on desperation. My countless calls to the specialist's office only yielded the frustrating response: the doctor is busy. He will call you back. But that call never came. Determined to uncover the truth hidden in those ultrasound images, I took matters into my own hands, parking myself near his car after his workday. The specialist was visibly shocked to find me there. There was no subtlety in my approach. I practically tried to force an answer from him. His bewildered expression shifted as he hesitated before urging, "Tell your wife to get an abortion." That's all I got from him, nothing more. His profound fear caught my attention. I couldn't fathom why he seemed so terrified about our baby's unusual condition. Then, the arrival of a black van nearby intensified his distress. His eyes fixated on it, and the fear seemed to double. As I left, deliberately passing close to the van, the driver's window lowered. Two men in suits and sunglasses shot me an eerie look. As the doctor drove away, the van started up, following him ominously into the unknown. The fear gnawed at me, a constant unwelcome companion. It was this creeping sense of being watched, a feeling like unseen eyes were tracking our every move. Then came that night in the apartment. We woke up, not to the comforting hum of the fridge or the distant sirens of the city, but to a bone-chilling silence, broken only by the frantic thumping of our hearts. In the inky blackness, a presence loomed, unseen but undeniable, radiating an oppressive dread that seeped into our very bones. I am telling you, that night there was more than us in that apartment. Only the Lord knows what that presence was, but it felt otherworldly. We fled that night, seeking refuge in Lee's parents' house, the unease clinging to us like a second skin. That's when I started getting anxiously suspicious about the gap in our memories from the night out camping in the wild. The pieces started falling into place, the strangeness of that event, the unexplainable pregnancy, the constant feeling of being watched. They all pointed towards something not of this world. The doctor's frantic insistence on more tests, his desperate pleas for termination. What further fueled my suspicion was that the doctor always had excuses not to see us or kept the sessions ridiculously short, never giving any clear answers to any of our questions. To myself, I wondered if it was his way to punish me for the time I creeped up to him in the parking lot, or if he was hiding something from us, possibly both. This wasn't a normal pregnancy. This was something else entirely. God knows what. Lee, bless her heart, refused to listen. Motherhood blazed in her eyes, a fierce determination that trumped logic and fear. She was going to have this baby, no matter what the test said, no matter what dark secret it held. Eventually, I decided it's better to let her live her naive dream. Denial can be bliss. I was hoping that she was right. I was hoping it was merely me being paranoid. If the baby was abnormal, we would have it anyway if that is what she wanted. The climax arrived like a sucker punch. Lee went into early labor, the doctors acting frantic, their faces etched with worry. Then came those two men in suits, their expressions unreadable, barring my entry to the delivery room like guardians of some forbidden secret. It was like they were hiding something, something terrifying. When they finally let me in, it was over. The baby, they claimed, died during the procedure. We never saw the body. Some fabricated story about a mix-up, an admin error. A wave of relief washed over me, an undeniable sensation despite the crushing grief clawing at my insides, a hollow echoing in my chest. Lee was devastated. It was slow, but time heals all, and she recovered. The years that followed were a haze: marriage, 3 beautiful, normal children, a life built on laughter and love. We tried to build normally and succeeded to a large extent. And that is our story. Yet it does not end there. Sometimes I wish it did. Ignorance would have been a simpler path. Something was off. Both of us shared nightmares, became our unwelcome souvenir. We never spoke of them, but the knowing glances confirmed our mutual torment. Weeks of normalcy could be shattered by a single morning, both of us awakening as if we'd relived that night in the wilderness every time, both of us at the same time. Its synchronized nature was disturbing. These random nightmares could come at any time. It couldn't continue. When our youngest, barely 5, noticed our erratic behavior, his innocent question cut deep: why are mommy and daddy in such a bad mood some mornings? Desperate for answers, we confided in a trusted psychologist. He suspected suppressed joint trauma and referred us to a hypnotherapist and her practice partner. Our separate but simultaneous sessions with the two hypnotherapists uncovered the horror. It all came out, or most of it in any case, or so we believe. Gosh, I think we would have preferred the amnesia. The memories were horrific. The oppressive silence of the woods, the sudden blinding light that filled our tent, the feeling of weightlessness as we were lifted skyward, the colossal metallic craft hovering silently above. Then came the figures themselves, tall and slender with elongated limbs and skin that seemed to shimmer in the otherworldly light, their faces shrouded in shadow, radiating an unsettling calm. Their movements devoid of human emotion, their large almond-shaped black eyes, that is one thing that I can't get out of my mind since the regression sessions. And of course, those creepy six-fingered hands touching everywhere. The details were terrifyingly clear. The sterile examination rooms, the cold metal instruments, the unsettling hums and piercing screams. We were not the only ones. They forced us apart. They controlled our bodies and movement. We were taken to separate rooms where we endured unspeakable experiments. From me, they extracted samples of primal instinct, telling me it wasn't what later transpired with Lee. For her, they did something far more monstrous, invasive, and unbelievable, manipulating her body and planting the unwelcome seed of that child. We didn't know their motives, but had to endure their cold touch and emotionless indifference. Emerging from the therapist's office, we clung to each other, trembling, tears mingling with the bitter sting of confirmation. Those fragmented memories finally coalesced into a horrifying whole, confirming our darkest suspicions. We weren't just abducted, we were subjects in some experiment, unwilling pawns in their grand design. Regular therapy sessions became our battleground, where we wrestled with the horrific memories and lingering trauma. Despite the semblance of normalcy we rebuilt, the shadows of our experience clung to the corners, whispers of what if clinging to the air. But the heaviest shadow loomed large, the baby, the one we lost. The burden became unbearable, a weight threatening to crush us both. I embarked on a mission for answers, tracking down the retired doctor across state lines in a Sarasota restaurant. Years etched on his face mirrored our own. He unveiled the truth, the 6-digit codes on tiny limbs, the oversized head, the huge black eyes like bottomless voids. Each unsettling detail chipped away at our hope, while the revelation of its survival, spirited away by shadowy figures claiming government affiliation, plunged us into a new abyss of fear and confusion. There's more to the story, secrets too unsettling to share in the open, but one even if the answers lead us deeper into the darkness. I faced a grim battle with a rare blood cancer, one that offered little hope for recovery. With the harsh reality of my condition looming over me, I made the tough call to forego treatment, accepting the uncertain road ahead with a heavy heart. In the weeks leading up to Christmas of the year in question, our secluded farm on New Zealand's South Island bore witness to a peculiar phenomenon. Strange lights danced across the evening skies, their erratic movements defying explanation. At first, we mistook them for PLS, but their sudden shifts and unpredictable patterns hinted at something more enigmatic. Our farm, nestled in solitude and isolation, seemed a world unto itself, far removed from the chaos of urban life. The sightings of these mysterious lights became our own private intrigue. We refrained from discussing it with anyone. One night, a week before Christmas, as we sat down for dinner, I noticed through the window a light descending on the paddock next to the house. When it touched the ground, I could see it was a disc-shaped craft. Instinct kicked in, and I reached for my trusted hunting rifle, hands quivering with a blend of fear and determination. But before I could even grasp it, they emerged creatures straight out of a nightmare, their insect-like forms contorting in the dim light of our home. There they were, right inside our lounge. No idea how they so suddenly entered. It's like they just materialized. Their presence suffocated the air. It felt like the gaze of these four beings pierced one's very person. We were in a state of hyper-shock. Mary stood behind me, arms protectively enveloping our daughter. Mary recalls our innocent Leah seemed wondrously amused by the creatures, while Mary and I were in a state of pure anxiety and dread. We stood frozen, trapped by an invisible grip, unable to break free from the fear that held us in place. Despite my efforts, my limbs refused to obey, rendering my weapon useless against the encroaching darkness. I don't think any words can describe what was going through my mind at that time. While you are reading or listening to this, imagine for a while being in such a bizarre and threatening situation. While doubting my eyesight at that moment, in fact, doubting my very sanity, I simultaneously am confronted with protecting my wife and child against creatures that can simply materialize or dematerialize as they please. All of this while they control my body, rendering me absolutely incapable of my duty as protector of my young family. The entire thing is simply too ghastly to describe. That experience left a lasting mark on me. As swiftly as they had appeared, they vanished, leaving us trembling in the wake of their inexplicable visitation. This eerie experience was a chilling reminder of our vulnerability in the vast expanse of the unknown. As Christmas Eve enveloped us, the air buzzed with the anticipation of the cherished family gathering in festive March. The following day, our joint families were driving all the way to spend Christmas Day at our place, stay over the night, and drive back on Boxing Day. Despite the shadow cast by my illness, we had painstakingly prepared for the occasion, fueled by the promise of love and laughter that awaited us. Mary, ever the embodiment of resilience, orchestrated the culinary symphony in the kitchen with practiced finesse. The aroma of roasting turkey and freshly baked pies wafted through the air, a tantalizing preview of the warmth and joy that awaited us on the morrow. Yet beneath the facade of holiday jubilation lurked a solemn reality, a truth I had grudgingly come to terms with. This would be my final Christmas, a poignant reminder of life's transience and the relentless march of time. The events of the previous week were still on our minds, but as it caused no harm except for freaking us out, we decided that we would not let it feature in our thoughts for the next few days. If only it was going to be that simple. As the night wore on and darkness blanketed our home, a disturbance shattered the tranquility. I jolted awake, a sense of disquiet creeping through me like a silent specter in the night. Emerging from the comfort of my bed, I stumbled into the enveloping darkness, my heart pounding like a drum in my chest. As I bore witness to a sight that terrified me, one of those very same otherworldly creatures was in our house. As I stood in the hallway, I saw it slipping into Leah's room like a phantom in the night. It seemed not to notice me, or maybe it was simply not bothered by my presence. Fear spurred me onward, my footsteps resounding through the silent corridors as I hastened to my daughter's side, only to find her bed and room empty. They had taken her, but how? Panic seized me. I grasped for the phone, desperate for aid in the face of the unknown, but fate, it seemed, had different plans. The telephone lines remained eerily silent, they were dead. The familiar hum was replaced by a chilling stillness beside me. Mary stood, her features etched with a blend of fear and disbelief. We found ourselves adrift in a sea of uncertainty, our world unraveling with each passing moment. Suddenly, there was a flash of light. I thought it was the craft outside taking off, whisking our daughter away, only the Lord knows where to. And then, as if beckoned by some unseen force, a wave of dizziness swept over us. The next moment, I felt sick. I remember Mary saying her head was spinning. Strangely, we both fell unconscious right there by the phone, both of us at the same time. If it was not so strange, I would have said our collapse was brought on by sheer shock, but I firmly believe it was something else. Look, both Mary and I, even amidst my illness, were pretty level-headed people. We were not the type to simply faint. The morning broke with the events of the night before veiled in a haze of uncertainty. As awareness slowly returned, I found solace beneath the covers. Mary's reassuring presence by my side offered comfort in the midst of turmoil. The covers in bed. How did we get to bed? My last memory was of us losing consciousness in the hall by the phone. But then a worse memory, Leah. They've taken Leah. Then something unexpected and beautiful happened. A sweet, innocent voice beckoned us from our slumber, drawing us to the warmth of the lounge. There, bathed in the soft morning light, sat Leah. Her laughter was a melody that chased away the dread and fear. Relief washed over us like a tidal wave, cleansing our hearts of doubt and anxiety. She was safe, untouched by the darkness that had threatened to consume us. We held her close, her embrace the ultimate gift I would receive on that Christmas day. As we basked in the joy of her presence, a sense of peace settled over our home, a peace forged by the unbreakable bond of family. We never discussed the events of the previous night or days with our family. Despite the horrific events leading up to our Christmas, the day itself turned out to be a beautiful experience of love and joy. As it was going to be my last, I only wanted to focus on making that Christmas the best memory for Mary, Leah, and our folks. We kept it that way throughout the festive season. New Year's came and was another joyous event with friends and family. Yet after that, life had to return to its normal routine, and with that returned the doubt and fear. Beneath the surface, a lingering doubt nagged at us, a question unanswered. What had truly transpired on that fateful night, and why did Leah's memories remain veiled in mystery, her innocence untainted by the chaos that had engulfed us? We sought answers as the new year broke. Without revealing too much, as we did not want them to think we were crazy, we had Leah checked out by a pediatrician and a psychologist. Both found her to be in excellent health and showed zero signs of trauma of any kind. So the truth remained elusive. Leah, a beacon of hope, stood unwavering in her innocence, her laughter a reminder of the resilience of youth in the face of uncertainty. However, her apparent lack of any trauma amidst what happened to her puzzled us. Yet, we were grateful our daughter was unscathed by whatever happened to her. Then February came, and it was time for my visit to the oncologist. Even though I knew what the path forward looked like, these visits were required to manage my condition as best as the clinicians could. I steeled myself for the tests and examinations. Blood was taken, and we had to be back for a follow-up the next day. I prepared for the inevitable affirmation that the cancer was staying its course. My only dread was that it might be speeding up, which would mean even less time with my family. When the specialist finally entered with an expression of confusion, I knew he had further bad news for us. Then our world changed. His words, when they came, shattered the darkness like a beam of light. Your cancer is gone. I will never forget his words. I remember him saying something like, "You are extraordinarily lucky. This type of cancer simply does not disappear by itself. Besides, severe cases like yours have never been successfully treated. Yet, here you are, clean, without any treatment." More tests were done, but they all confirmed the same. It was a miracle, pure and simple, a reprieve from the brink of death that defied all reason. Jubilation surged through me as we made our way home, hope and gratitude intertwining in a dance of newfound life. Yet with all that I had to celebrate, something was unresolved. At the edges of my consciousness, something was awakening, an unwelcome guest in the midst of celebration. And then, like a storm on the horizon, the nightmares descended, a relentless onslaught of visions and memories, each more nightmarish than the last. Strange lights and alien faces haunted my dreams, their presence a specter that loomed over me in the dead of night. With each passing day, the memories grew more vivid, more visceral, until the terror etched into my being. I relived the ordeal in agonizing detail, the chill of extraterrestrial surgical instruments, the pain of probing, incisions, grotesque needles, and more, all inflicted by beings that seemed devoid of empathy or remorse. Amidst the darkness, a paradox emerged. It was bittersweet, for within their cruelty, the insectoid creatures bestowed upon me a gift beyond measure, a second chance at life, burned through pain, sheer dread, and horror. The ordeal is too harrowing to recount in further detail. I cannot fathom why the creatures subjected me to such torment. Lily, now married with 3 beautiful children, remains as joyful and vibrant as ever. Untouched by the events that transpired all those years ago, despite undergoing regression hypnosis at our urging, she recalls nothing of significance. Curiously, it appears she was never abducted. Sarah and I seem to have manufactured memories of searching for her at home. Sarah never developed any nightmares or memories even remotely like mine. After all our anxieties about the apparent abduction of Lily, it seems that I was the only one who got taken. The motives behind the creature's actions remain shrouded in mystery. Nevertheless, their intervention led to my survival. Faced with the choice between enduring these haunting memories and succumbing to cancer, is there truly a choice? Thousands of beautiful memories created by a long and fulfilling family life have made the horror of the abduction 100% worth it. We received a chilling account from a brave individual who endured a harrowing encounter with enigmatic beings from another world. In this video, we delve into the spine-tingling story of their abduction and the shocking twist that left us questioning the nature of such abductions. I hope this letter finds you well. I wanted to share an experience with you, something that happened to me one fateful night that still sends shivers down my spine whenever I think about it. It was a late weekend night, and I found myself driving down a desolate stretch of roads surrounded by farms and dense forestry. The full moon bathed the landscape in an eerie silver glow, and I was deep in the heart of nowhere. As I continued my journey, I noticed an unusual light in my rearview mirror. At first, I dismissed it, thinking it was either another vehicle or the radiant full moon casting unusual shadows. However, my unease grew when a sharp beam of light suddenly engulfed my car. Panic coursed through my veins as my vehicle began losing power, the engine sputtering to a halt, and every electrical system shutting down. With trepidation, I stepped out of my car to investigate the source of this mysterious light. What I encountered next would defy all reason and logic: a flying saucer, yes, a UFO. The sight was unlike anything I had ever seen. It had landed right in the middle of the road. My heart raced as I watched in awe and terror as three small gray beings emerged from the craft. I know this might sound unreal, but the experience was real and simply terrifying. These beings were small, no taller than 3 feet, with slender bodies and a gray complexion. Their heads were disproportionately large, featuring oversized pitch-black almond-shaped eyes that shimmered with an otherworldly intelligence. They only had the slightest of noses and what seemed like slits for ears. Their mouths were also subtle lipless slits. Their fingers were long and delicate. These small but scary beings were clad in sleek, form-fitting bodysuits that bore an eerie jet-black hue. The fabric seemed to adhere closely to their diminutive frames, emphasizing their slender and otherworldly appearances. These suits appeared to be made of a material unlike any I had ever encountered, possessing a peculiar sheen that hinted at an advanced and unfamiliar technology. The texture of the suits had an almost metallic quality to them, adding to the otherworldly aura that surrounded these beings. It was as if these beings, dressed in their enigmatic black suits, were emissaries from a realm that defied human comprehension, leaving me with more questions than answers. As they approached me, walking with an uncanny grace, I felt a strange sensation wash over me as if they were communicating with me through some form of telepathy. They moved in unison, their movements fluid and synchronized. Without uttering a word, they conveyed a sense of urgency, gently guiding me toward the entrance of their craft. It was as if they had the ability to exert control over my actions, making resistance futile. The hypnotic spell they cast upon me left me with no choice but to follow their lead, stepping through the metallic threshold of their enigmatic vessel and into an entirely new and unsettling reality. Inside the alien craft, I found myself in a room that defied any earthly description. The walls seemed to be constructed from a seamless silvery metallic material, casting an otherworldly shimmer across the entire chamber. There were no discernible corners or edges, creating an unsettling feeling of disorientation. The room was bathed in a soft bluish light that emitted from concealed sources, casting eerie shadows in every direction. In the center of the room lay a peculiar silvery metal slab, its surface smooth and polished to a mirror-like sheen. The slab had restraints of an unknown design, composed of a material that resembled a translucent gel-like substance. These restraints seemed to respond to the touch of the aliens, conforming perfectly to the contours of my body as they secured me in place. It was as if the slab itself was a living entity, adapting to their will. Surrounding the slab were an array of strange and intricate instruments, unlike anything found in human technology. Some emitted faint rhythmic hums, while others displayed holographic readouts that I couldn't comprehend. Tubes and wires snaked across the room, connecting to various devices, and it became clear that I was the subject of their experiments. The atmosphere was charged with an otherworldly energy, and my fear was palpable as I lay helpless on the metallic surface, unable to comprehend the full extent of what was about to transpire. The aliens surrounded me. While I was on the slab, one of them pulled down a mechanical arm with a kind of needle extending from it. He brought it towards my eyes. At first, I freaked out, but then my faith kicked in. As I am a spiritual person, I knew I had only one resort of help to turn to. It is because of my faith that I discovered a peculiar phenomenon. Every time I called out to my Creator and began to pray, something incredible happened. It was as if a divine presence filled the room, and I became certain that the Creator Spirit was with me. My prayers seemed to unnerve my captors, and I realized that my faith was a powerful weapon against them. Their fear was palpable, and it was evident that they were afraid of something far greater than themselves. It seemed to terrify them. With each prayer, they backed away, unable to withstand the spiritual force that protected me. As I continued to pray fervently, an astonishing and unexpected sight unfolded before my eyes. One of the little gray aliens, the one closest to me, suddenly exhibited signs of intense fear and distress. Its large, almond-shaped eyes widened even further, and it began to emit high-pitched, distressed sounds that I can only describe as a mixture of chattering and whimpering. In a shocking turn of events, the alien's body language conveyed sheer terror, and to my astonishment, it began to involuntarily urinate, causing its tight suit to become soaked with a pale liquid. The liquid pooled around its feet, creating a strange and unsettling scene within the sterile metallic chamber. It was as if my prayers had triggered a profound and unexpected reaction within the creature, revealing a vulnerability I could never have anticipated. This bizarre and surreal moment served as a reminder that, despite their advanced technology and seemingly superior knowledge, these extraterrestrial beings were not immune to fear. There were forces beyond their understanding that could instill terror even in the most enigmatic of creatures. It was a turning point in my harrowing ordeal, as I realized that my faith had the power to influence and protect me in ways I could never have imagined. In a twist of fate, they eventually released me, dumping me by the side of the road not far from where they had abducted me. As I watched their craft disappear into the night sky, I couldn't help but feel a profound sense of awe and gratitude for the divine intervention that had saved me from an unimaginable fate. This experience has forever changed my perspective on the mysteries of the universe. It serves as a reminder that even in the face of the unknown and the terrifying, there is a force greater than anything we can comprehend, a force that shields us from the darkest of terrors if we turn towards it. My island on June 28, 1947, Captain Tony, who worked as a harbor patrolman officer in Ireland, was on patrol with his two rookies, his son, and his dog. However, this was no ordinary day at sea. When Tony gazed up into the sky from his patrol boat, he saw 6 aircraft floating around 1,500 feet above his watercraft. The objects were reported by Tony and his crew to be made of a reflective material and were shaped like flat donuts, about 100 feet in diameter. The center holes located on each craft were noted to be about 25 feet in diameter, and more circular objects were located along the sides of the aircraft, which Tony and his crew determined to be observation windows. Soon, Tony and his fellow crewmen noticed that 5 of the UFOs circled over the 6th, and the 6th itself was lowering towards the patrol boat. This caused immense panic among the crew because they all thought that the aircraft was going to collide with their patrol boat. Not wanting to be sent to a watery grave, the crew hightailed it toward the shore. Upon reaching the shore, Tony retrieved his binoculars to spot the bizarre aircraft from the shore. He also grabbed his camera to take photos as evidence of the strange aircraft. While taking the pictures, the lower craft stayed in a still position while the 5 others circled around it for about 5 minutes. Then, the lower aircraft suddenly dropped down but stopped abruptly at about 500 feet above the water. One of the 5 ships circling around the lower ship came down to meet it. The 2 crafts stayed in this position for several minutes until Tony thought he heard a thump. Instantaneously, more thumps followed, and Tony, using his binoculars, saw that the middle aircraft was dropping what Tony suspected to be newspapers from the inside of its center hole as it swiftly approached his watercraft. When the aircraft got close enough, it was discovered that the objects weren't newspapers but instead white, lightweight metals and black, lava-like rocks. Tony even stated that when the lava-like rocks landed in the sea, it caused the water to steam. With these dangerous pieces of debris falling ever closer to their boat, the crew sought cover below deck. However, not before one of the materials struck Tony's dog, killing it in the process, and another one wounded his son in the arm. Tony even tried to radio for assistance, but the transmitter wasn't functioning. Even though his radio was out of action and no help was on the way, most of the debris splashed into the water. Soon after the raining of metals and rocks, the airships rose up high into the sky and zoomed westward together. The crew then exited the lower deck and examined the boat for any damage. Luckily for the crew, the boat was hardly damaged, and they set sail back to their dock, lowering the dog over the side and into the water in the form of a burial at sea. Upon docking, Tony took his son to the hospital so that his wounds could be treated and afterwards explained the incident to his boss, Mark, who didn't believe Tony. When the photos Tony took of his patrol were printed and examined, the strange airships Tony had informed him of and showed him in the now-developed photos were compared and believed to be film noise and damage caused by radiation. Not wanting to shy away from proving the incident's authenticity, Tony returned to island to collect rock samples in hopes of finding the ones dropped from the middle aircraft that he had encountered during the incident. Tony reported that while he did this, he spotted one of the aircraft hovering above him as if it were spying on him. He eventually gathered the rocks and was preparing to show them to his boss the next day. But when that day came, he was visited by a small, pale man in a black suit. The man suggested that the pair of them should get breakfast together, to which Tony agreed. So, he followed the stranger to a restaurant. While they ate breakfast together, the strange man asked no questions but instead gave a descriptive account about what Tony had witnessed the previous day and eventually warned Tony that bad things would happen not only to him but to his entire family. Men then acknowledged that Tony had been telling the truth. So, the pair of them sent a package to publisher Ray Palmer in Chicago, who later founded Fate magazine. The contents inside the package were the metal fragments and statements about the strange incidents and findings on the 21st and 22nd of June, a noteworthy incident that we continue to discuss and debate amongst ourselves to this day. Yet not even a month later would another incident occur that is possibly the most well-known and talked about alien encounter in history, Roswell. On July 8, 1947, in the small town of Roswell, New Mexico, there were reports of a flying disc that crashed into the desert not far from the Walker Air Base. This made front headlines around the world. The reports noted that bodies of aliens had been retrieved from the crash site and were hauled to the infamous Area 51 Air Base in the Nevada desert, where autopsies were performed and carried out. Shortly afterwards, a press release by high military authorities stated that rumors of a flying saucer had become something of a reality and that an intelligence officer at the Roswell Army Airfield was fortunate enough to gain and hold possession of one of the saucers. This statement sent newspaper reports of the incident around the world insane, and news headlines of this Roswell flying saucer were everywhere. However, just 24 hours later, that high military authority changed their story, stating that they had made a mistake and that the flying saucer was actually, in fact, a weather balloon. Unbelievably, the public appeared to have accepted this explanation, and very little was said about the Roswell incident for many years afterwards. It wasn't until the late 1970s when some military personnel involved began to speak out about what happened all those years ago, and ufologists, as well as conspiracy theorists, went into overdrive, thus developing the Roswell case into the incident as we know it today. One of the first military personnel to speak out about the Roswell UFO incident was Major Jesse Marcel. He was one of the 2 military personnel sent to investigate the crash site. The other one who was with Major Jesse Marcel was Sheridan Cabot, who had always claimed that he wasn't even there. Major Jesse Marcel described how large amounts of metallic debris were scattered all over the area, so the craft had obviously hit the ground at a high speed. He stated that it was clearly not a weather balloon, aircraft, or missile because he recovered fragments from the crash and described seeing hieroglyphic types of writing painted on it. The metal was also reported by him to be light, thin as paper, but incredibly strong and hard, which was unlike anything he had ever seen in his career and life before. He also helped answer the question as to where the fragments were taken by simply saying not only did they have the one he analyzed but others as well, which are being kept well preserved in a military installation somewhere. Marcel's story doesn't end there, however, because later in life he told his expanding family about his investigation at Roswell. According to his grandson, my grandfather Marcel would privately share details of his experiences with the entire family. And when I was a kid, basically around the dinner table, he told us how he was the head of intelligence and lead investigator of the 509 bombing group. He would talk about it with people, continuously asking a multitude of questions about the Roswell UFO incident. The National Security Agency published a report in 1994, a staggering 47 years after the initial incident, which stated that the alien bodies supposedly recovered from the crash site were, in fact, just life-size test dummies. Many saw this as the government just trying to dig itself out and cover up the situation, which only continued to fuel conspiracy theories. Lots more witnesses came forward and spoke out about the Roswell UFO incident, including a photographer who claims that he was asked if he could photograph the crash site. He explained how he was asked to take photos inside a dark-tinted area where he observed 4 identical bodies with humongous heads and shadowy skin. After taking the pictures, he was debriefed and ordered to forget everything he noticed at the crash site. But then a witness more credible than everybody else combined spoke out just before he passed away in 2005. His name was Lieutenant Walter Haut, the man who published and released the original weather balloon report back in 1947. Before his passing, he wrote and left a sworn affidavit in which he claimed that the weather balloon story was a cover-up for the UFO that had been successfully recovered from the crash site. He also confirmed that he had seen dead alien bodies in this still widely debated Roswell UFO incident. With these 2 incidents raising so much speculations and questions, one might ask if we will ever know what went on. However, as the years fly by and as the people who were involved or witnessed these incidents pass away, we are really only drifting further away from the inevitable answer. So until the government sheds light on this mystery or the next incident does that for us, we can only continuously marvel at the fact that these 2 instances combined have been not only the gateway to extraterrestrial debates as we know them today, but also might just be the biggest government cover-ups in history regarding human contact with alien and otherworldly beings. Though these 2 events are the most widely renowned encounters with extraterrestrials, thousands of encounters have been reported throughout the world to the present day. I never told anyone this story because I never thought they would believe me. I was home alone one evening and had gone to sleep for the night. I lived with my significant other and 2 indoor cats, but she was out of state traveling for business. My junior year in college, I had a strange experience. First, a few background details. My dorm room was attached to my roommate's, so I had to go out through hers to get to the bathroom or the hallway. She was a light sleeper, but I wasn't the type to be out late, so it didn't matter. I had 2 normal operations in my life at that time and discovered that while under anesthesia, I would wake up briefly toward the end before I was supposed to. If I got a mosquito bite, I had to deal with it for at least a month. I'm not a fast healer. One night, I had the most vivid dream of my life. I woke up briefly somewhere else and then went right back to sleep. In this dream, I looked left, I looked right, and then I passed back out, just like if I was in surgery. I was on a hospital gurney, slightly inclined, facing the wall. There was ambient noise behind me, and the echo suggested it was a very large room. There was nothing sinister about the noises. On either side of me was a row of empty hospital gurneys. At my feet, just to my right, two people were having a conversation sitting on a bench against the wall. One was a person in a dark suit, the other, I don't know what it was. It was small, and I saw its hands, which appeared to have darker, grayish skin. They were speaking together, so animated and excited, like two old friends who hadn't seen each other in years, and they didn't notice me wake up. I didn't recognize the dialogue. Though I don't speak German, Mandarin, Russian, etc., I can recognize them when I hear them. This language was wholly unrecognizable, yet the person in the suit was fluent. I went back to sleep. In the morning, I said to myself that was a messed up dream and went to the shower. As I passed my roommate, who was still in bed, she asked, "Where did you go last night?" I thought that was odd. After my shower, I started to put my makeup on and noticed something on my face. I leaned closer and could not believe what I saw, two perfectly parallel lines, impossibly thin and impossibly perfect. There was some clear hard gel on the top, and that's what I felt. There was no blood. My own hair was thicker than the width of the cuts, yet I could see down into my skin a little. This was 1996. I had never seen anything like this. These days, I would say it was a laser cut topped with liquid Band-Aid, but neither of those things seemed prevalent in those days. I said, "Okay, there's an explanation." I slept on a staple or a paper clip. I do homework in my bed all the time. I went and scoured my pillow for anything sharp and found nothing. So, I got my sewing needle, a staple from some homework, and a paper clip. I dunked them in hydrogen peroxide and made cuts on my face similar to what was there. Immediately, blood welled up, and the skin was jagged from all three objects, and the width of all cuts was thicker than the laser cuts. I determined that nothing in my room could have made the cuts. I didn't have an X-Acto knife, but I knew the blood would well up the same way if I did. I skipped my first class as I tried to figure out what to do. I kept obsessively feeling my face all day, in awe of the perfection of what was there and how it could have come to be. There were only two people on campus rich enough to have a digital camera, which meant I would have to borrow a friend's 35mm because I didn't have my own. That meant I would have to explain myself to my friend and possibly the photo shop when the pictures came back. Who would I even give the photos to? Who would I even contact, and what would I tell them? In those days, if you even said the word alien, you were a pariah. After hours of mental debates sitting on the edge of my bed, I gave up thinking about it and finished my classes for the day. I sat on the edge of my bed into the night, debating, unsure of what to do. In the wee hours of the morning, I woke up. The cuts were gone, completely healed, no trace of even a scar. I was disturbed for a few days, but then I eventually forgot about it. A few years after graduating, I decided I was going to have some dental work done and went to two different offices to get quotes. They both took a full facial X-ray. I had long since forgotten my crazy dream and the cuts until I sat down across from the first X-ray technician and pointed to a strange thing showing up above my teeth. I asked if I was looking at a mirror image because it was on the same side as my cuts had been rather than the opposite side. No, I was told, the X-ray was actual, not a mirror image, so the right side of the image corresponded with the right side of my face. I pointed to the almost square image above my teeth and asked what that was. "It's just an X-ray anomaly," he said. He didn't seem bothered by it. I figured that meant there was some damage or irregularity with the X-ray plates and let it go. Then I went to the second dentist, an orthodontist, and had another X-ray done. You guessed it, the square was there in the exact same place. This time, I didn't even try to make polite small talk or beat around the bush. I pointed to the square and said, "What is that?" This time, the tech looked at me funny and said, "It's an X-ray anomaly," and she leaned closer and whispered, "We see them all the time," in a way that gave me goosebumps. This was in Spokane, Washington. I didn't know what else to say, so I said nothing. Could it be that whatever negatives or plates or whatever they used for an X-ray were damaged in exactly the same spots and exactly the same shape? Maybe, I guess. I don't know much about X-rays. But after that, I reflected on my situation. I don't feel freaked out, but I think there might be something in my face put there by somebody else. Here's what I know. We do this all the time to other species. We chase them in helicopters, shoot at them with tranquilizer darts, take rectal temperatures, take blood samples, stamp radio tags in their ears with no regard to if it hurts or the trauma of the event, or if their furry buddies will ostracize them later because they have something funky on their ear. In my situation, I was clearly well cared for, if it really happened at all. Someone was there as some kind of representative on my behalf. I was handled in such a way that if I didn't have a weird metabolism, I wouldn't have known what even happened. I never once felt pain. My cut healed instantly. If this is some kind of research-driven radio tag for the purposes of data collection or preservation of habitat or species, like we would do, they did it with far more regard for me than we have for other species on our own planet. I don't know what might happen if I get another X-ray 20 years later. I have tried to look when I go through airport security if anything shows up on the image we see in the booth, but I don't see anything. Surprisingly, I'm okay with this. I think it might just be science and nothing nefarious or evil. I wish my consent to be asked first, but I suppose it's hard to ask for consent when you're not even supposed to exist. I worked from 9 to 5, then came home, ate, and then worked on the old house to get it ready to sell. One night, after an exceptionally long and rough night of working on the house, I was on my way home when I saw in the sky something that routinely is not there. I stopped to watch the object only to see it not move at all. Now, realize this is around 1 a.m., and it's not a hot air balloon or anything like that, especially since I have never seen one in my area of Ohio. What I was looking at was an oval. It was wider than it was tall. The object, as many people explained, was not giving off light but was illuminated, if that makes any sense. I was so tired I almost wanted to shrug it off, but I just couldn't for some reason. Not only was it way too bizarre, but what I had been wanting for the last 48 years was happening right before me, my first and so far only UFO sighting. To say I felt spooked would be an understatement. I got back into my car and drove the short 1,000 feet or so to get to my driveway and to the safety of my new home. I knew there were details I was not able to see because of the way the craft was illuminated. Then it dawned on me, nobody's gonna believe me. So, at 1:30 a.m. on a school night, I went into the house and scared my daughter and son by waking them up to witness what was in the sky. I hoped to God it would be there still, and sure enough, it was sitting right there where I left it. I am covered in goosebumps just recalling my daughter's reaction. My son was a huge skeptic, but even at the age of 12, when he witnessed it, looking back, he knows what it was. I saw fear in his eyes. He stayed out with us for about a minute or two, then went back inside. My daughter and I were almost speechless. It was beautiful in a way, but we both agreed that it gave off a feeling of fear or dread, like we were not supposed to be seeing this. Then it struck me, I should get some binoculars. I happened to know right where they were because I did most of the boxing for our move. I grabbed the binoculars and was stunned at what I saw. The best I could describe it was it looked totally old on the bottom, like it was made from old clad iron shipped long ago, pounded out metal, like with rivets and seams. The top looked very modern, I guess you could say. I remember it had something that resembled what I would call headlights on the back window, like some old cars. I also remember the top almost being shaped like a genie's lamp. My daughter looked through the binoculars and had a terribly similar description. Then I saw something that freaked me out even further. It now looked as though the craft was sitting on a long, thin, yellowish pedestal. I could not figure out what I was now seeing. I gave the binoculars to my daughter, by the way, she was 16 at the time, and asked her to explain to me what she saw at this time, what had changed. I could hear the absolute fright and quiver in her voice. I will never forget what she said. "Dad, there's a beam of light coming out from under whatever it is." "I'm scared, Dad. I think we should go in." We could not shake that feeling of fright and the feeling that we should have never seen what we did that night. Both of our bedroom windows faced out directly where this craft could be seen. I found out later my daughter stayed up until morning on live video chat with her friends, absolutely terrified. After showering, I laid in bed exhausted but overwhelmed by what we just saw. It was at this point that I noticed the craft was moving, but at such a slow rate it was undetectable until I was able to compare it to something stationary, which was my vertical windowsill. I will never forget that dull, eerie, pale yellow light this craft illuminated. I forgot to mention that if you held out your arm, the craft was just slightly larger than the width of your thumb, if that makes any sense. I was told later that that is quite large. Eventually, the craft traveled out of sight, and I crashed from exhaustion. It was late afternoon, and I was probably around 10 years of age at the time. I was on my way home from my school football when I realized an odd man was walking along my street. At first, I stopped walking and examined the man for a moment. There was something about him that just did not sit right with me, the way he moved, the way he looked, the way he was looking at things in such definitive detail. I could not really put my finger on it. All I knew was that his presence made me feel extremely uncomfortable. I went and sat behind a car so he could not see me, and I waited for a few moments as he walked into somebody's driveway out of view. I ran back to my house, which was only a few doors down. It did not take me too long to reach my driveway. However, when I stepped onto my driveway, I felt like I was being watched. I did not look back. I rushed into my house to tell my mom and grandparents what I had just seen. Of course, they just brushed it off and made an excuse for it to not be some kind of alien man. I could not be bothered to stand around and try to convince them, so I went up to my room and stared. I stared out the window for a while, and then there they were. My window looks out into the driveway, so I could see him clearly. He was tall, maybe 6'5" or so, and extremely skinny. His neck was abnormally long, and his shoulders were narrow. He wore a white sports jersey and a pair of baggy jeans. The top of his head was large and veiny. Overall, he was a weird-looking person. I bolted downstairs with the most intense adrenaline rush I had ever had to tell my family. Out of breath, I stuttered out my words, and they walked out into the living room to take a look for themselves. My mom's face turned pale as she stared into the eyes of the person who was now stood up right against the living room window, so close, in fact, that you could see the condensation from his breath on the glass. He gently pulled up a notebook from his pocket and started writing. As this happened, everything was quiet, and everybody was frozen in place. It was the eeriest atmosphere I have ever experienced. A few seconds passed, and he finished taking his notes. He strolled back to the driveway. Still pale, my mom turned to me with an expression of terror and complexion. The only thing we knew to do from here was to contact the police, which we did. However, they looked for this man all over the neighborhood and could not find him anywhere. Overall, this experience has probably been one of the most bizarre and terrifying I have ever had. I am hoping someone can help me figure out what happened here. I'm hoping somebody can tell me who or what this thing was. I've read a lot of things online, and this sounds a lot like abductions I've heard in the past. Luckily, I didn't get abducted, but what do you guys think? I work in the pro department of a home improvement company. I worked the closing shift with another cashier, who I'll call Aria. Aria's a really kind but quite timid cashier. She's also very pretty, so she has a lot of contractors hit on her. It's usually not that worrisome, though a few compliments, maybe a dinner invite, which she politely declined. I would probably ask her out as well if it wasn't for one detail: Aria does have a girlfriend. So being hit on by guys on a daily basis makes her rather uncomfortable. When we first met, I told her she ought to tell those guys about being gay, but she kept saying it wasn't any of their business, so she kept that part to herself. Aria has become my best friend, and having another cashier there with you keeps things from getting lonely. We even cover for each other's lunch breaks. One day, when I came back from lunch, Aria started telling me about this rather creepy guy who was flirting with her. She said she politely turned him down, saying she was with someone already, and while he didn't seem happy, he did leave. I shrugged it off as nothing more than the usual horny guy and laughed it off. But later that day, the man came back. Aria wasn't there, as she had left to help a customer find some lumber, so it was just me. He looked rather normal, probably handsome to most women, but he acted off. After looking around the area, I asked him if I could help him with anything. "I'm here to see Aria," he told me. I asked him how he knew her, and he said he had come in earlier and asked her out, to which she said yes, so he had come back in to pick her up. I told him she had left for the day, a usual lie everyone tells to cover for their friends. His smile went away as he started looking annoyed. He said he wanted to speak to Aria and ask her out again, which contradicted what he had just told me about accepting his previous invite. I told him he could not do that, which caused him to cross his arms and asked me why not. I'm not the best liar when it comes to making up excuses on the spot, however. I didn't want to tell him Aria was gay if she didn't want him to know it. So I just blurted out that Aria was my fiancée. His annoyed look went to confusion as he asked me how someone as pretty as she is could go out with someone like me. I'm not a Chris Evans or anything, but I don't think I'm that bad looking. I told him it didn't matter and that she and I were getting married in a couple of months, so he needed to back off. He gave me a death look but didn't say anything. After an awkward silence, he left. After Aria had gotten back, I told her what went down. She asked me to describe him, and after I told her what he looked like, she said that was the same guy who came in before. She was a bit creeped out by what went down but found the fiancé excuse rather funny. She even stated she'd rather be engaged to me than go out with him, which I'm guessing was a compliment. A couple of weeks went by, and we had all but forgotten about the man. At this point, one night after it had gotten dark, Aria and I were getting the trash together so we could close down the registers and go home. Just then, we heard a bang at the door, causing both of us to nearly jump out of our skins. It was the guy again. He had a wild look in his eyes as he kept his face pressed against the glass. "We're closed," I told him, but he insisted he needed to come in. Aria yelled again to tell him she's not interested and for him to go away and leave her alone. But he yelled that he's not here for her, he's here for me. He then says that if he can take out her husband, then she'd be all his. Based on that, he wanted to kill me. I told Aria to run to the manager's office and call the police, and I'd stay here and watch him. I won't lie though, I was pretty afraid to be in that tiny little area. If the guy was able to get in, he wasn't the biggest guy, but he could have had a weapon on him. Plus, the store doesn't allow us to have self-defense items on us, so I was on my own here. The guy then started ramming the sliding doors like he was crazy. The doors were rattling. I could have sworn they were going to come off their base. Just then, Aria came running back around the corner with a 2x4 in her hand, yelling that the cops were on their way. Finally, the man decided to leave. The closing manager met the officers when they came, and he took them to review the cameras. Thankfully, the man was caught and arrested, but Arya and I felt unsafe working there any longer. We're still friends and even attend the same college together, but we have separate jobs now while we pay our way through classes. I'm glad she was there to help me with the rogue man, as I hate to imagine what he might have done to me, or worse, what he might have done to her. She says she's glad I was there for her as well, as having a guy around tends to make men like him less confident in what they might try. It was a wake-up call for me as to how dangerous it can be for some girls when an interested guy just doesn't want to take no for an answer. During the summer last year, I chose not to take any classes and got a job at a gas station right next to my college campus. I was sort of disillusioned with school and wanted to make some money while I had time off. The gas station was one of the first places I tried applying to, and it turned out to be the last when they hired me on the spot. I thought it was a little weird, but I didn't question it. Unfortunately, they said they only wanted me for the night shift, which was from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. I knew it would wreak havoc on my already messed up sleep schedule, but I decided to go for it and just see how it went. To my surprise, most of the time it wasn't that bad. The first few hours of the shift were pretty busy, and it would get crazy, but then it would always get really slow until about 5 o'clock in the morning. This gave me plenty of time to clean, stock the shelves, and chill out until the morning rush. Occasionally, somebody suspicious or problematic would wander in, but I never had anything get too out of hand. Well, that was of course until something did happen. It was a Thursday, which wasn't usually a busy night. I had a coworker until about midnight, then they went home, and I was left alone. Time went by pretty fast, and before I knew it, it was almost 2 a.m. That's around the time a man walked in, and I immediately had a bad feeling about him. He had a shaved head and a bunch of tattoos of weird symbols, so I was pretty sure he was a skinhead. I noticed he had parked his dirty old lifted pickup truck in the handicap spot too, but I didn't want to get on his case about it. It was 1:58 when he walked in, and he spent a few minutes wandering around the store. In the end, though, all he bought was a case of beer. However, by then it was 2:01. My county has a law that says alcohol can't be purchased between 2 a.m. and 6 a.m. I told the man that, as politely and apologetically as I could, that he couldn't buy the beer. He immediately became agitated and went off on a rant about how it was a free country and that it was a stupid law. I tried my best to reason with him, and I said that I was just trying to do my job. But this only made him start to criticize me like I was some kind of spineless pawn for my boss. That's when I asked him to leave if he was going to be that way. Then he suddenly changed his tone again, acting all chummy and saying it wasn't a big deal and that I should bend the rules for just a few minutes since it was before 2 o'clock when he walked in. He kind of made a good point, so I eventually caved just so he would get out. I sold him the case of beer, and then, of course, he asked for a pack of cigarettes to go with it. I let him have it as there was no rule against tobacco sales. He smiled at me and then left the store. I breathed a sigh of relief, but that relief was short-lived. I thought he would get in his truck and leave, but instead, he opened the tailgate and sat down on the truck bed. He cracked open a can of beer and started drinking it. Now I had a feeling that this was far from over, and that was exactly the case. A few minutes later, another truck pulled up right next to his, and a couple of guys got out, both of them with shaved heads and tattoos. They stood around the back of the first guy's truck, just smoking and drinking. I knew I had to go out there and tell them that they couldn't loiter in front of the store and that it was illegal to drink out in the open like that, especially that close to a car. But I was a little scared already. They kept looking in the window at me, smirking as if they knew what I was thinking and were challenging me to try. Before I could find the courage, another car, this time an SUV, pulled in next to the two of them, and two more guys got out and joined the others. They were all part of the same skinhead group, without a doubt. My guess is they were coming from a bar that had just closed and didn't want to end the night yet. That was the most reasonable explanation, but my paranoid thoughts made me think they were about to get together and burn down the store because the owner's wife was Mexican. Then the first guy came back into the store. He was drunker than before and all smiles. But then he came back to the register with another case of beer. I was about to tell him he definitely couldn't buy it at that time, but before I could even open my mouth, he looked at me all smug and said he really wouldn't want to disappoint him and all of his friends. I took that as a pretty solid threat, so I let him do what he wanted. My hands were shaking, and I was dreading having to count change in front of him. But then he told me to keep the change, like he was giving me some kind of big tip. He walked back outside, and all the skinheads cheered at the fresh case of beer. Apparently, they had worked together and finished all 24 cans of the previous one. I then realized they had been tossing the empty cans all over the ground and kicking them around. It felt like I was completely stuck with these pricks, and I knew I would either get in trouble over it or get literally ganged up on and have any manner of horrible things done to me just for saying no to them. What normal person would see a bunch of drunk skinheads smoking cheap cigarettes on top of their pickup trucks in front of a store in the middle of the night and still want to walk past them to get in? Pretty much nobody, not a single person, except more of the skinheads. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I walked up and locked the door so they couldn't get back in. Then I walked back to the office and called the police. Several minutes later, a cruiser showed up and told them to screw off. There was some shouting outside that I couldn't quite make out, but I was worried for a few minutes that things would escalate. Thankfully, they left without causing too much of a scene, but I have no idea how close it got. The cop waited for them to leave before doing so himself. Right before he got on his way, I came out and asked him to stay a while I cleaned up their mess. The next day, I unfortunately had to quit that job. There was nothing more terrifying to me than the thought of being stuck behind that register if those guys ever decided to come back. Still, I kind of get worried that one of them will see me around town and recognize me. I don't know what those people are all capable of. All I know is my town is full of dudes like that, and they're always causing problems. Years ago, I worked as a barista at a locally owned coffee shop that doubles as a popular venue for local artists and musicians to host all sorts of small-time gigs. Even today, it gets most of its business in the evenings during the open mics and stays open until 1 a.m. However, when I worked there pre-2020, they were open 24/7 from Thursday to Sunday. For the most part, everyone that worked there hated the graveyard shift. It was easy hours, but the tips were abysmal as barely anyone came in. As far as I was concerned, however, I didn't mind the lower pay. What I hated was being alone and running the only place that was still open for miles. The shop was in a good part of town, if not a little close to a bad part, but the fact of the matter is that there's really no such thing as a good side of town during these overnight hours, if we're being completely honest. I was advised to never keep more than $50 in the drawer during the graveyard shift for a reason. I was always afraid that somebody would drag me into the back of the store, so every time I was scheduled for the overnight shift, I asked one of my male friends to come hang out with me. The one guy who would help me more than anyone else was named Bob. It usually turned out to be a good time. I made some money, I slipped him some beers under the table, and of course, I felt much more comfortable not being a woman on her own. Bob would work on his laptop while I was busy, and we would talk when things were slow. We had been friends for a while, but we became close after spending a lot of time together. It was always platonic, though. Bob was also friends with many of my coworkers, and lots of us joked that Bob knew so much about the coffee shop that he might as well work there himself. But he always laughed it off and said his career in photography was more important, which we always gave him a hard time for. I didn't really think there would ever be any bad blood between us, and if there was, I was sure it would be because we slipped up and had an awkward one-night stand. But then came a slow Saturday night in the summer of 2019. I was working the last overnight shift of the weekend. I had worked the last 2 nights in a row without Bob because he had bailed on me to go to a wedding for one of his family members. I managed to get another friend of mine to fill in for him for Thursday and Friday, but on Saturday night, they were too tired and never showed up. I was anxious about being alone in the shop, but I knew I could manage. Thankfully, it was surprisingly slow that night for some reason, and by 3 a.m., I had only made $10 in tips. But I was glad I didn't have to deal with any crazy people. Unfortunately, that's when things took a dark turn. The shop was completely empty except for me. I was putting a batch of coffee into the roaster when, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a figure walk past the front window. I glanced over, but there was nobody there. I waited for someone to come around to the back door, which customers could also use, but a full minute had passed now, and nobody came. I stuck around by the register for a few more minutes, but after nobody showed up for a while, I decided it was time to mop the floors. I went into the back to fill up the mop bucket, and of course, as soon as I turned the faucet on, I heard somebody come in through the front door. I shouted that I would be with him in just a minute, then finished filling up the bucket and rolled it out behind the counter. When I got there, whoever came in had disappeared. I shrugged it off, just figuring they had gone straight to the bathroom, and then I started mopping behind the counter. The stranger's feeling hovered over me. I couldn't place what it was, but I knew something was wrong. The first thing I looked at was the drawer, but it hadn't been broken into. Even then, that would have been loud enough for me to hear over the running water. I leaned over the bar and checked the bathroom doors. The men's room door was closed, and the light was on, so I knew somebody was in there. My stomach churned slightly as I knew it was a man in there, but so far I had no real reason to think anything was wrong, so I just kept on mopping. When I finally got finished behind the counter, the bathroom door opened, and to my surprise, Bob walked out. I immediately felt a sense of relief, but I had to ask him what he was doing there. He explained that he had just gotten home from the wedding and thought he'd stop by and say hi. I was grateful that he decided to show up, so I told him he could have whatever he wanted on the house. I got behind the espresso machine and got to work pulling a shot. I packed the grounds into the portafilter and locked it into the machine, then looked over to say something to Bob. But whatever I was thinking of saying was immediately forgotten. His facial expression had gone from friendly to devilish in just a moment of time, and suddenly a wave of chills went through my body. "What are you doing?" I asked, fighting back trembling. Bob grinned like a psychopath and pulled a knife out from behind his back. "I'm finally going to bang the barista," he said as he started to laugh. "Don't be crazy," I shouted. "We're friends." "What about the cameras?" Bob began walking forward, forcing me to backpedal. "We are friends," he said, "and nobody will believe you because the cameras aren't even on." "They never are." "How do you not know that?" I knew at this point I was being pushed into the back of the shop, and my throat started to close up. It was also in that moment, when I looked for an exit that I realized he had locked both the doors and turned the open sign off, keeping anybody from coming in. Your boss already thinks we do this every night, Bob pressed on, inching closer and closer. Stop it. I shouted in desperation, looking for something to defend myself and trying not to slip on the wet floor. Shut up, you screamed. You should have been giving this to me for months already. Do you not know how much time I wasted on you? I was pleading and about to be cornered. The last hope I had was something on the sandwich counter. In the last moment before he pushed me out of sight into the back of the shop, I grabbed for the panini press and ripped it off the table, slamming the corner of the metal against the side of his head. He tried to block me and sliced open my arm, but I connected the hit. Combined with the water on the floor, the blow knocked him off of his feet. I wasted no time climbing over the counter and rushing out of the back door. I slipped into my car while I locked myself in and called the police. It wasn't until I thought about driving off that I realized Bob had parked his car in front of mine to deliberately keep me from getting away. Moments later, while I was on the phone with the operator, he came outside and attempted to break his way into my car. After he failed to do so for several minutes, he gave up and drove off, not long before the police arrived. I was treated for my wound and gave my statement about what happened. I didn't leave out a single detail. I was too much in a state of shock to even be in disbelief. As it turns out, he was right about the cameras inside the shop just being for show. However, nobody thought I was lying about what he did. Unfortunately, though, due to civil liabilities on the part of my employer and, more importantly, the fact that Bob completely up and disappeared after posting bail, I decided to drop the charges. I came to the conclusion not long after that he had already ruined his life sufficiently, and I simply didn't care enough to do anything else about it. Nobody has seen or heard from Bob in years, and the coffee shop has since stopped staying open overnight. I've been a night owl my whole life, so I work night shifts exclusively. I really don't work well with other people, whether they're my coworkers or not, so I picked a job I could do completely on my own. I became a nighttime janitor for my local school district after I graduated from high school. Schools have always had nightly cleaning as part of health codes in most areas, but obviously, in recent years, it's become much more important. My first job was in a fairly large K-12 school. There were a couple of daytime custodians as well, but at night it was just me and one other person splitting the school down the middle. My coworker and I barely ever interacted, which I appreciated a lot. Every single night, all the floors get mopped or vacuumed, every desk, table, and door handle is disinfected, and every toilet, urinal, and sink also gets cleaned. It takes a full 8-hour shift to accomplish, and for that entire time, I don't talk to a single person. It's great, honestly. Most of my coworkers are women, and they don't want me talking to them either. When I tell people about my job, a lot of them think the hardest part is cleaning up after the messes left by the students. For the most part, I guess they are right, but I always tell them I would rather plunge and clean 10 clogged and traumatized toilets every single night than ever have to work directly with another human being all day long, especially a horde of minors. These days, there's one example I give of why I say that. It was the night after Halloween. I came in for my usual shift and got started without even saying hello to my coworker. We started on opposite ends and met in the middle, so we would only see each other when we were finishing up. The first hour was mostly normal except for one obvious thing out of the ordinary. I always keep my music at a low volume on my headphones, but from outside them, I kept hearing things. Usually, all the other faculty are gone by 8 p.m., but sometimes there's somebody who stays late. I couldn't decide what I was hearing through my music, but I wasn't in the mood to turn it off, so I just ignored it. A little while later, I took a break from mopping to change the water in the bucket. I was gone for about 5 minutes, but on my way back to where I stopped, I walked past one of the hallways I had just mopped and noticed the wet floor sign had fallen over. For legal reasons, I had to step over the wet floor and stand it back up, then mop back over my tracks. Annoyed, I walked over to it but froze for a moment when something else caught my eye. There was another set of tracks in the water, leading to and from the sign. They were little footprints, something a kid would make. After I stood the sign back up, I followed the tracks, knowing I would have to mop over those too, basically redoing the whole hallway. The tracks ran all the way to the end, where there was a flight of stairs up to the second floor. From there, they dried up pretty quickly. I stormed up the stairs and got to the second floor, but nobody was there. I took my phone out of my pocket and paused my music so I would be able to hear if anyone was running around. Right as I looked down, I saw a flash of movement at the end of the hallway. I also heard a bunch of footsteps echoing across the empty school, so I started making my way to the end of the hall. By the time I got there, I still couldn't see anyone, but then I heard a little kid laughing. It felt like I was in a horror movie, but at that point, I was more annoyed than scared. I stood there looking around for a few seconds until I heard a crash from the first floor. I rushed downstairs and nearly flipped my lid when I saw the mop bucket I had just refilled was knocked over. The water was spilling everywhere in a huge pool. I absolutely swore my head off as I went back to the nearest janitor's closet for a dry mop and a bunch of towels. It took me half an hour to clean up that mess and then another 15 minutes to redo the hallway that got messed up, which meant my break was down to 15 minutes. However, I was so pissed off that I walked to the other side of the school and interrupted my coworker to ask if she had been messing with me. She looked completely dumbfounded and innocent. She asked if I was all right or needed any help, but to that, I just walked away. I set up again and got back to work. Another hour passed, and I managed to make up some lost progress. I was angrily powering through it, debating in my head the whole time about what I should do. I thought about reporting it to the school or maybe just calling the police myself, but in the end, I figured I would seem crazy to everyone, just like I did to my coworker, so nothing happened. Again, until 11 o'clock, out of nowhere, the lights shut off in the whole school. It was pitch black for about 3 seconds until the emergency lights turned on, giving everything a reddish hue. It came as a shock to me, and to be honest, I was worried. I tried to tell myself it was a malfunction or maybe some kids messing around, but my mind was going to all sorts of possibilities. I had keys to the electrical room where the light switches were, and I was the closest to it, so I stopped what I was doing and marched over. I was pissed off about losing more time and missing out on my entire break. But halfway there, something pushed those concerns out of my head. I heard the most blood-curdling scream of my life, the panic shriek of my coworker echoing endlessly. I stopped in my tracks, feeling like I had just been hit by an electric shock. Seconds later, I heard the sound of a door opening really loudly, like someone was ramming through it from the inside. I hoped it was my coworker escaping and not somebody else making their way into the school. I forced myself to keep going and finally made it to the electrical room. I was right outside the door trying to find the right key when I noticed that it was already cracked open. I pushed it open slowly, afraid of what I might see, and a shape appeared in front of me, standing unnaturally in the darkness. My blood ran cold. It could have been anyone. I gave up on trying to turn on the lights and instead reached over for my phone in my pocket. However, as soon as I moved, the figure bolted forward and slammed the door in my face. I cursed and jumped back, stumbling until my back hit the wall behind me. Once I regained my balance, I started running. I wanted to leave, but for once in my life, I thought about the well-being of somebody else and ran to the other side of the school to find my coworker. After checking a few of her hallways, I finally found her mop bucket sitting alone in the middle of the floor next to a bathroom. Without hesitation, I rushed over to it, hoping not to see any evidence that she had been hurt. Nothing seemed unusual except for the fact that she was nowhere to be found. I looked all around in the dim lighting, but as far as I could tell, I was alone. But not completely alone. The sound of a laughing child echoed in the distance again, striking fear into my chest. I clutched the handle of the mop, for lack of anything else to defend myself with, and lifted it out of the bucket, holding the end of the handle out like a spear. I faced the direction of the laughter, looking down the hallway so intently I got tunnel vision. In a moment of sheer terror, someone whispered, "Hello," into my ear. I turned around and, without thinking, jabbed the handle of the mop into their chest with all my might. I heard a grunt as the person who snuck up on me hit the ground and vomited only a second later. I shouted at them to tell me who they were, but then they started to cry. I could tell they were trying to hold it back, but they couldn't. Gradually, my eyes made out what I was looking at. It was a student kneeling on the floor. Suddenly, all my fear of danger was replaced with the fear of losing my job for hitting a student. However, as things shook out over the next few days, it turned out all right. Two twins in the 9th grade and their little brother got the idea to keep the spirit of Halloween going and prank the overnighters in the school by hiding in the lockers. There was one set of lockers in the whole building that wasn't in use and had no locks or ties on them, and those kids were skinny enough to fit in there and hide. After doing their after-school activities, they managed to avoid being expelled, probably from crying a lot. The school district understood my actions and let me keep my job, but I was transferred to a different school. All in all, this is why I don't like people, especially kids. Up until about a year ago, I worked at a grocery chain. I was, and still am, a working college student. My availability was only 6 p.m. to closing, which in this case was midnight. It wasn't my favorite job. I dealt with a lot of annoying customers and coworkers, one of whom once broke into my locker and put a used tampon in the pocket of my apron, but that's a whole different story. My job was walking distance from where I lived, which made it really convenient since I didn't have a car. One Friday night, I was closing as usual with my supervisor, and we were running later than we usually did. My supervisor and I finally got the remaining customers out of the store, clocked out, and left. I left before my supervisor and began walking home. After a long, frustrating day of annoying customers, it felt great to just walk through the fresh winter air. I spent a few minutes shuffling through my phone's playlist to find a song to walk home to. I had made my way down the main road, careful not to slip on any of the ice. One thing that's really important to know about me is that I'm a very anxious person, and while it's definitely a problem most of the time, it does help make me constantly aware of my surroundings. That's when I saw an approaching car slowing down on the deserted main road, and I automatically went on high alert. It was a black car that came to a slow stop against the sidewalk I was on, about 10 feet behind me. I immediately clutched my phone in my hand and brought it out of my pocket. If there wasn't any ice covering the sidewalk and my feet didn't hurt, I probably would have run. Instead, I opted to try and pretend that I wasn't afraid, which I don't think worked because I picked up my pace after the car stopped. It was then that I heard a man's voice call out to me. "Hey, it's cold out here. You want a ride?" the man said. I kept walking away from him up the street, pretending I didn't hear him and just hoping he would go away. It didn't work. A few moments later, I heard the car tires crushing the ice on the road and then turned around to see what he was doing. He was now driving with the car in reverse. When he caught up to me, he had rolled down the passenger seat window some more. He was a black man, maybe in his mid to late 30s. He looked at me and I stopped, prompting him to stop his car as well. "Hey, let me give you a ride," he said through the car window. I didn't know what to say. I wanted to be polite because even though I was scared, I tried to be rational. All he did was offer a girl a ride home who was walking in the cold at night. Also, with the possibility of him being a kidnapper or a rapist, it was really best not to piss him off on the empty street. "No thank you," I said politely but firmly that I hesitated for a second. I was trying to figure out what to say that would get him to leave me alone away which street I lived on. "I'm okay," I insisted. "Thanks, though." As I finished thanking him, I started walking again, now putting both headphones in with the song paused. It was more of a way to signal that I was done talking to him. He didn't say anything, but I knew that he was watching me walk away. I felt relieved when I got a few more feet away from his car and heard the sound of his tires driving away. Unfortunately, the situation was only getting worse. As I started walking past the entrance of a car dealership, I saw the same car making a U-turn in the middle of the street out of the corner of my eye. When I turned slightly, he pulled up to the sidewalk yet again, this time a few feet in front of me. The man then opened the driver's seat door and got out of the car. It was at that point I was actually afraid I wouldn't make it home that night. He looked at me with this weird expression on his face. He had this really focused look while trying to look casual. It's really hard to describe. He started walking up to me. This kind of situation had never happened to me before, but I always thought of dangerous hypothetical situations in my head. I guess thinking about those situations prepared me to an extent because before I even realized it, my phone was already against my ear like I was on the phone with someone, even though I wasn't. When he came closer to me, he saw my phone in my hand and must have realized someone could know where I am right now, or I could be calling 911. That's the only explanation I can think of because when he looked at my phone, his demeanor totally changed. He stopped in his tracks with a worried look on his face and then asked me, "Oh, are you on the phone with someone right now?" I replied, looking at him with my phone still against my face and my other hand casually in my pocket. Without saying anything else, the man immediately turned around, got back in his car, and then started to drive up the street. I walked slowly at first, letting some distance grow between us, but as soon as I felt safer, I walked up the street as fast as I could without slipping. I frantically tried to call my dad, who I thought was home at the time. He didn't pick up. I then tried to call my sister and my fiancé. I didn't feel like I was in danger anymore, but my adrenaline was through the roof and I wanted to hear from someone who would make me feel better. I gave up calling after I couldn't get in touch with anyone and just kept walking. I was finally getting ready to turn onto another street when I passed an empty parking lot and saw the same man leaning against his car looking over at me. "Hey," was all he said in a flat tone when I walked by. At this point, I was completely freaked out. I didn't have my phone out anymore, so I couldn't pretend I was talking to someone again, and I was also significantly closer to my house. If he decided to get into his car and follow me, there wasn't any detour I could take to try and lose him. I was now on the verge of tears, and that's when I decided to call 911. I called 911 and told them the situation. The officer on the other line stayed on the phone with me until I got into my house. After that, an officer came to my house and asked me a bunch of questions about the man. He also asked me about his car and where I last saw him. All of the details were either too vague or I didn't remember. He said that he would at least patrol the area for him. I'm not really sure if he actually did or not, but it made me feel better at the time. From that point, I needed a ride to and from work every shift until I got my schedule changed to day shifts. Just a few weeks later, the college semester ended and I was planning on skipping a semester anyway. That experience only reinforced my decision. The more I think about that situation, the more I realize how lucky I was. I was in the perfect position to be taken, but I actually used some quick thinking that really de-escalated the situation. I moved in with my fiancée, and now I have a pocket knife and pepper spray for whenever I walk home at night from my new job. It's something to remember. If you haven't called 911, if you don't have anything to defend yourself against someone, either let someone know where you are or pretend that they know where you are. It can potentially save your life. I regrettably used to work at a hotel in our town. Our town had gotten hit by a hurricane a few months back, and a lot of houses were badly damaged, so many people vacated the place. The hotel is about a 15-minute walk from my house. The town and hotel name I'll leave out of this, as I really just don't want anything traced back to me. The hotel was a very standard bed and breakfast type place, you know, where they serve wet scrambled eggs, frozen sausages, and assorted cereals. The hotel had a busy month after the hurricane, as some people were out of their houses due to damages. But after a while, things quieted down, if anything, quieter than before the hurricane. I always worked nights from 6 p.m. to 2 a.m. Then someone would relieve me at 2 a.m., and they'd work till 10 o'clock or 11 a.m. I could always see how many people were checked into the hotel, and at the time, it was only maybe 9 rooms, which wasn't a lot at all. I could go the whole night sometimes without seeing anyone. There was a back break room for employees with a coffee machine, fridge, table, and a couple of sofa-type chairs. The employee bathroom was also back there. At night, I spent most of my time back there. There was a bell at the front desk that people would ring if they needed anything. I was in the back when I heard a deep voice from the lobby saying, "Hello," repeatedly. I got up and went through the door leading to behind the counter and saw a man on the other side of the glass. There was a glass barrier with an opening underneath about 10 inches high. He said he needed towels. I grabbed him a couple of extra towels and slid them under the glass for him. He grabbed them rather aggressively, shot me this weird look, then walked to the room's hallway. I stayed in the lobby, now sitting in the rolling chair by the monitors, and I just watched that man on the camera walk down the hallway. He was looking around weirdly, then he started rubbing the towels on his face. I said out loud, "What in the world?" Then he got in the elevator, so I went back to the break room. It was maybe 10 minutes later when I heard a voice again from the lobby. It was the same voice. I walked back out, and that man was standing on the other side again. He said very loudly, "My key card is broken." I asked what his room number was. He said it was something random, like 2C something with a letter in it. Our hotel rooms strictly had numbers, no letters, so I knew this man was lying. I told him, "Sir, our rooms don't have letters. Are you sure you're staying here?" His reaction was not something I was expecting, nor was it something I wish I ever had to be a victim to. He threw the towels on the floor, started smiling, and slightly tilting his head as he got closer to the glass. When his face was practically pressed up on the glass, he said, "I'm going to kill you. still with a smile on his face. Then he said it again, louder and again. Each time he said it, it got louder until it was almost a scream. I screamed back at him, "I'm calling the police," and I did. I picked up the phone and showed him as I dialed 911. He kept his disturbing smile as he now started mocking me, calling the police. As I spoke to the dispatcher on the phone, explaining very loudly what was happening in front of my face, the sick man laughed and headed for the door in a slow walk. I told the dispatcher he was leaving, and when he was gone through the doors and out of sight, I said he was gone. She asked me if I still wanted an officer to show up, and I said no, it's all right. So the next couple of hours of my shift went slow. I decided for obvious reasons to hang around in the lobby now instead of the break room. There was one guest who checked in during this time. At around 2 a.m., my relief came, and I clocked out and was free to go home. I walked outside to the parking lot. It was cold out. I remember wishing I had brought my coat. I walked with my hands in the pockets of my light jacket and my hood up. Then I heard a voice in the parking lot. I turned around. There was a line of bushes that covered the first floor windows of the hotel. It came from the bushes. I don't know what the voice said. I didn't care. I walked faster now. Once I got out of the parking lot, I was on a main road for a brief minute, but there were no cars on the road in this quiet town at this hour. After a minute, I turned left down a residential street that would eventually turn onto my block. It was dead silent out, not even the sound of any distant traffic, just the sound of my shoes hitting the pavement. And then the sound of someone else's shoes hitting the pavement behind me, only it was the sound of someone running as if on their tiptoes, trying to be quiet. By the time I turned around, they stopped. There was a car right behind me, and I almost knew that there was someone hiding behind it. I heard laughing and then a familiar voice saying quietly, "I'm going to kill you." Without even seeing him, I knew it was that man. I looked around, planning out my next move. I couldn't outrun a man, let alone wearing my work shoes. I looked at the nearest house that had an upstairs light on. Someone was awake. I would go run and ring the doorbell for help. I looked back at the car, and I saw him, that man, peeking his eyes out from behind the car as he inched around it to the front. When he got to the hood, the rest of his face and upper body were exposed, and I could see his disgusting, crazy smile again. I ran for the house, screaming, "Help me." I made it to the front door and rang the bell at least 3 times. That's when the man grabbed me and started choking me, whispering in my ear, "Die." In that moment, I thought my life was flashing before my eyes. Then an angel in the form of a man opened the front door to the house and screamed, "Hey," at the man choking me. The man's grip was released from my neck, and I fell to the floor. I never turned to watch the man run away, but the man from the house helped me up and brought me inside. He gave me water and called the police for me, and I explained the whole story to the police. They collected the CCTV footage of the man from the hotel and put feelers out to track him. I was called into the police station when they did a lineup of people who looked similar to the man on the CCTV footage, and I was asked to point out which man I thought was him. I looked at all 5 of them for like 5 minutes, and I ultimately said it wasn't any of them. I don't know if the pressure and nerves got to me, but in the moment, I truly didn't recognize him to be in that lineup. I hope to this day I didn't make a mistake and let that man roam free. So this happened a little over 2 years ago now. It was 2017, and I had just started a new job at a motel. It was low pay, but I needed an office job. One of my friends, John, got me this job. For a few days, I did training with the owner in the mornings. For 2 nights, John trained me. Our job was the 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. shift, nothing exciting, just checking guests in and doing paperwork. My boss, or the owner, went away with his wife on vacation for a week, which contributed to the swift training I had to endure. So it was my first night alone on the night shift. There was a monitor with security cameras around the motel's property and large glass windows all around the office building with a glass door. There was no night window like most motels have. It was fairly early in the night, at about 1 a.m. I was just doing my normal check-in paperwork when a man walked in and asked if we had any rooms available. Usually, if someone sketchy came in, my boss had me lie and say no. But he seemed normal at the moment, so without hesitation, I said yes. I began creating the reservation on the computer when I noticed he started swatting the air and making spitting noises as if he was being surrounded by flies. I tried to ignore it. As far as I was concerned, it wasn't my business, so I tried to check him into the room as quickly as possible. I gave him his key, and he was on his way. At this point in time, I could be described as very timid. I had a lot going on in my personal life, so I hope you can all understand my reaction to what happens next. The man came back from his room and slammed his hand on the glass door, causing me to jump, absolutely frightened. I looked up to see him just staring at me. He cracked the door and put his head through and said, "I can't get into my room. Why won't you let me into my room?" And my only defense is trying to be helpful, so I replied, "Maybe there's something wrong with your key. Let me give you another one." The look he had in his eyes was inexplicable. I felt like I was in absolute danger. I handed him his new key, and he went back to his room. I tried texting John because he's the one who trained me, though it was the middle of the night and he was asleep. I needed some guidance. With no reply from John, I noticed the man trudging down the stairs to come back. I went into absolute panic mode. I ran into the back office, locked the door, and pulled out my pocket knife. It's important to keep protection when working at night. I heard the man in the office yelling, "Hello? Hello? Why won't you let me into my room? Do you not like me?" Being an absolute idiot and not standing my ground or just calling the police when I was feeling scared, I decided to take the situation on alone. I replied, "I'm just on the phone. I'll be right out." I then started calling John over and over for help. No answer. I decided to take a few breaths and then step out of the office. The man was not there. He was in the bathroom. I started hearing him talking to himself angrily, saying, "Kill her, kill her." My heart sank. Still being an idiot and not calling the police, he came out, and I said, "Your key was broken. I'm sorry. Let me escort you to your room." He agreed. Thankfully, I was wearing a long-sleeved sweater, so with my arms down, I was able to hide my knife in my hand while holding it. I began to walk outside, and he seemed insistent on walking behind me. We began making our way to the staircase and up towards his room. I was sweating from how nervous I was, continuously looking behind me to make sure he wasn't going to make a move. He stopped at a room, and I stopped at his room a few doors down. I smiled and said, "Oh, that's the wrong room. This is your room," as it was clearly said on the door. This whole time, he was going to someone else's room and trying to open the door. After letting him into his room, I quickly ran back to the office and locked the door. I found out there was a lone woman staying in the other room he was trying to get into. The next guest I checked in was a police officer from a few towns over. I felt bad for confiding in him about the guy, but he seemed willing to keep an eye and ear out. The next night, the man came back, but I had the doors locked and told him we were all booked up. I explained to my boss what happened when he got back from vacation. However, he didn't take it very seriously. I continued to work there on the night shift for the next year, where many other strange encounters happened, but this was one of the worst. I used to work as a night clerk in a downtown condominium. The association had a lot of security concerns due to the way the building was constructed back in the late 60s. Both levels of the parking garage were accessible from street level, so there were a lot of possible entry points, many of which were located in blind spots of the security camera system. For that reason, I was required to make 2 rounds around the entire building during my shift to make sure no non-residents had found their way in. The most serious issue we had was the occasional carjacking, but what I encountered most often was homeless people who had found their way into the garage and were huddling in some corner for a bit of shelter. Kicking them back out into the street was by far my least favorite part of the job, but I had to do it. After working there for several months, I knew all the spots that people liked to hide in. The building was very old and had undergone many renovations in its lifetime, which created a lot of nooks and crannies, unnecessary concrete protrusions, sealed-off rooms, and hallways and stairs that led to nowhere. The creepiest spot in the whole building was so weird and potentially dangerous that I took a picture of it and brought it up to management. On the first floor of the garage, there was a door that opened up to a corridor directly underneath the ramp up to the second level of the garage. It was about 3 feet wide and ran about 20 to 30 feet, but it led to literally nowhere. At the end of it was a large water pipe with a valve, which was the only reason the space existed. But in the dark, with just a weak flashlight, that pipe seemed to take on many other forms. What made it dangerous, however, was the lock on the door. There was no padlock or keyhole on either side, but on the outside was a large sliding bolt latch. There was only one way in or out, and it locked from the outside with no way to unlock it from the inside. Ever since I discovered the spot, I couldn't help but imagine how easy it would be for someone to get trapped in there. However, nothing I said to management made any difference. They were already aware of it and had no intention of doing anything about it. Unfortunately, that meant I would have to open the door and check on it every night, but I never stepped foot inside of it. I was way too scared of it. Things went on like that for months, and then one day my worst fear was realized. It was about 2 o'clock in the morning, halfway through my shift. I was doing my rounds in the parking garage, and everything was normal. It was a slow Wednesday night. There hadn't been any problems or suspicious activity on the cameras, so I was far from on edge at the time. But then, in one moment, I was forced to go on alert. I heard the sound of a door slamming across the garage. I wasn't exactly sure where it was, so I walked over to investigate. My heart sank a bit when I saw that the door to the dead-end hallway was wide open. I looked around to see if anyone was in the garage, but I appeared to be alone. I shouted to intimidate anyone if they were hiding somewhere I couldn't see, but I got no response and nobody appeared. I was just worried that there was somebody hiding in the dead-end hallway, so I walked the rest of the way. I shined my flashlight down the hallway, and for a moment, I was relieved to see that nobody was in there. There was, however, an empty glass bottle about 10 feet inside. I sighed and rolled my eyes, thinking that somebody had been drinking in there and had run out in a hurry once they saw me snooping around, accidentally making noise as they rushed. It wouldn't have been that hard for somebody to climb up on the cars parked there to get above the wall and hop the fence into the neighboring parking lot. By the time I got there, since the garage was partially underground in that spot, in fact, That's how a lot of people get in, because the dead-end hallway happened to be in a prominent blind spot of the cameras. Unfortunately, I wasn't allowed to leave trash anywhere if I saw it, so I knew I had to pick up that bottle. Of course, I felt the anxiety bubbling up inside my gut just for knowing I had to walk a few steps inside that hallway. I almost didn't do it, but I rationalized myself into thinking there was no way somebody would pop out and lock me in. I took a deep breath and stepped inside, but right as I reached the bottle, the door slammed shut. I immediately ran back to the door, but by the time I got there, it was already locked. I started banging on the door and screaming for help, but there was nobody there. I felt like I was being buried alive, like I could barely breathe. If it weren't for my flashlight, I would have been in some deep trouble. I wouldn't have been able to see a thing. Once I realized I wasn't getting out anytime soon, I reached for my phone. To my utter heartbreak, however, there was no service at all. The walls were made of cinder blocks, the door was made of metal, and the entire 6-story building was on top of me. No matter what I tried, I couldn't call 911. There was absolutely nothing I could do. I was completely stuck. The only way I was getting out was if somebody opened the door from the outside. But it was 2 o'clock in the morning, and it would be hours before anybody left for work. During that time, whoever trapped me was doing whatever they pleased in the parking garage. I heard several car alarms go off, and I knew what was happening. Somehow, they all turned off after a few minutes. I kept banging on the door and shouting, but nobody came. After a while, if I'm being completely honest, I gave up hope that I would be free anytime soon and just focused on staying calm. I sat down against the wall and turned off my flashlight to save the battery, but only after making sure I was completely alone. Every few minutes, I banged on the door a bunch of times. It took me about 2 hours, but finally, I managed to get the attention of somebody going to work early in the morning. I thanked them as they let me out, but unfortunately, the next thing I had to do was call the cops because I quickly noticed that a dozen cars had been broken into. There was broken glass all over the parking lot from all the windows that had been shattered. Whoever it was knew exactly what they were doing. They knew how to trap me in there and how to silence the alarms of the cars they were breaking into. We only had security guards on the weekends, and it left us vulnerable on a seemingly benign Wednesday. All in all, there were tens of thousands of dollars in damages and theft, and I was fired from my job. Not that I would want to go back anyway. The culprit was never identified on the cameras and was never caught. I was working as a waiter at Waffle House, choosing to work the 3rd shift because I had the best hourly pay and brought in pretty good tips due to us being the only 24/7 diner in the entire town. It took me about a year to save up enough money to rent a place in the city and get out of the middle of nowhere, but in that time, I saw quite a few things that still stick with me to this day. By and large, most of the customers I had were truckers and other random people traveling on the interstate through the middle of the night. The town was just a stopover point, not a destination. The so-called locals consisted of farmers and ranchers from the surrounding area, and anyone else like me worked in the fast food and hotel chains clustered around the interstate exit. The final and yet most characteristic residents of that depressing cesspit of a town were the vagrants, hitchhikers, tweakers, and destitute opportunists that had been stranded with us. They could be stuck there from anywhere to a few days to several years, clinging to the parking lots and awnings that were the only meager shelter for dozens of miles in any direction, panhandling for whatever they could until they got lucky enough to get a ride to somewhere else. Really, the only stressful part of my job was dealing with these people. In the beginning, I tried to be empathetic. After all, they are human. However, it didn't take long to end up like my usual coworker, the cook who had been there for 10 years and had seen just about everything. His name was Tony, and the only thing separating him from them was a steady position at the grill. Nobody ever got a chair thrown at them, as far as I know, but Tony was prone to throwing turners and other utensils at anyone who got on his bad side. I usually followed his lead based on his body language. He knew who was trouble and who wasn't. However, even with Tony as a reliable backup, things sometimes got out of hand. There was this one night that I'll never forget. I don't remember what day of the week it was, but all I know was that it had been unusually slow that night. It was around 3 a.m. when this guy walked in, and even I knew something was not right about him. He was wearing soiled clothes and a completely torn-up jacket, covered head to toe in dust, and he was in a completely panicked state of mind. The weird thing was that he said nothing as he ran past us, clutching his right arm to his chest, and immediately locking himself in the bathroom. Tony and I rolled our eyes at the same time, thinking, here we go again. Although I think we both had a feeling this wasn't a regular hobo bathroom emergency or a tweaker looking for a private place to do their thing. That's when I asked Tony, doesn't he kind of look familiar? He brushed it off at first, but then after a short conversation, we realized that he had been inside about 2 hours ago, desperately asking all the customers for rides until eventually we had to kick him out for being a disturbance. It seemed he obviously hadn't had any luck getting a ride, but something else had happened to him too. I became worried. If that guy needed help, it would be a while before an ambulance could get to him and even longer for them to take him to a hospital. Tony told me to take care of it, so I ran to check on the only customer we had in the store at the time and got them on their way. When I took the bathroom keys and went to check on our stranger in distress, I knocked on the door pretty loud. I asked if everything was okay. There was a pause, then finally a distraught voice answered me. I think I'm really hurt. I just need a ride. Suddenly, I knew something was seriously wrong. The sound of his voice made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I fumbled with the key ring as I told him I was about to open the door. Sir, if you need help, I have to come in there. I shouted. No. The stranger screamed. You have to come get me. I stopped for a second, confused, but then I snapped out of it and shoved the key in the lock. I turned it and opened the door to a terrifying sight. The bathroom was empty, completely empty. No injured man, no blood, no dust, just nothing. It was as clean as it had been since I last cleaned it, as if nobody had been in there at all. In fact, it even looked cleaner than that. What's going on in there? Tony shouted from the kitchen. I was just at a loss. I let the bathroom door close and stepped back. I looked at Tony and told him the truth. There's nobody in there, I said. Don't give me that. Tony shouted. See for yourself. I told him, and he did. He stormed over and barged through the bathroom door. I saw him go blank, just like I did, when he saw it, the impossible absence of a person. He turned around and looked inside the women's room too, but again, nothing. Nobody in there. In raw disbelief, we gathered ourselves behind the counter. We interrogated each other uselessly, thinking one of us must have let him slip by unnoticed. However, we both knew we had been on high alert since the second he came in. There was no way either of us would have missed him leaving within a fraction of a second. Our conversation ended abruptly when we both saw the same thing out of the corner of our eyes. The stranger was somehow outside, looking at us through the window. He still had his right arm stuffed out of sight, but now, as we got a better view of his face, we saw that wasn't his only problem. His face was bloody, like he'd been hit with a brick. His nose was broken, his lip was split and missing a piece, showing us his cracked and missing teeth. One of his eyes seemed completely swollen over, but the one that was open was gushing blood. Tony and I didn't move a muscle. We didn't even breathe for a second. After a few horrible seconds of realizing what was happening, I finally thought to call 911. But as soon as the idea occurred to me, the man started to move. He turned to the side and started to limp across the big front window. We watched him in silence as he made it all the way to the corner of the window, where it wrapped around to the other side. "What the hell?" I whispered, only for Tony to quickly shush me. It was at that moment I saw he had gone pale and wide-eyed, which only terrified me even more. Something about this man had gotten through Tony's defenses, and that meant we were not prepared. Before we could say anything else, we heard a crash from the back room. We both ran inside and searched for the source of the noise. It was coming from the walk-in freezer. Somebody was tearing things up and freaking out. Tony ran up there and threw open the door, and there he was, the guy. He had ripped open a box of burger patties and was clutching a handful of meat, pressing it to his right arm like an ice pack. When he saw us, he froze. The patties dropped from his hand and revealed the condition of his arm. His hand was stuck in a thumbs-up position, but his wrist had been snapped clean off, and his hand was dangling from the rest of his arm by a thread of skin. After a terrifying moment of deer-in-headlight stares, the stranger bolted from the freezer, crashing through both me and Tony. He sprinted outside, screaming, before we had a chance to react. I stumbled to my feet as Tony ran out to the dining area, locked the front doors, and switched off all the lights. Then he pushed me back into the back room and started yelling at me. "How could you leave the back door unlocked?" he yelled. "No, look. It's still locked." I pointed to the back door, and sure enough, it was locked now. Absolutely nothing was making sense, but we gave up on trying to decipher it for the rest of the night until the sun came up and the morning crew came in. We kept the doors locked and stayed out of sight. When we were finally freed from our nightmare of a shift and set out into the world, we noticed the train of police and paramedics on a freeway right outside of town. We asked around only to find out that a man had been killed in a hit-and-run right there at the off-ramp not even 1,000 feet from the Waffle House. He died sometime after midnight, but his body lay on the shoulder undiscovered until daylight. His corpse was mangled, but his thumb was still sticking straight up from trying to hitch a ride. Of course, by the afternoon, they had scraped him off the pavement and washed away his blood until the spot where he died was cleaner than I'd ever seen it. My name is Maury. I'm from the USA. Years ago, I worked in a home for older people as a nurse. I had the night shift. We were together drinking coffee on the second floor. All of a sudden, we heard a loud bang, so we thought a client had fallen. We decided that I would take the second floor and my colleague would take the first. Maybe we could find out what happened. While my colleague walked down the stairs, I looked at the monitor, which was on the second floor, and I saw someone in the department on the ground floor. He was inside the closed apartment. You could walk in over there, but you needed a code to get out. People with dementia lived there. We watched for a while, and the guy was stuck, he couldn't get out. We decided to go inside a room on the second floor of one of our clients because you needed a special key to go inside. We thought that was safer. We explained to her what was going on. She was perfectly capable of understanding the situation, and of course, we called 112. I explained the situation, and they told me they would come right away. I called my husband, who also had the night shift as a security guard in another town not too far away from us. He was just talking with the cops while I called 112 and said they were on their way. When I hung up, I looked outside and saw that guy climbing out the window. So I called back. They asked if something had changed. The police arrived, and we did a walk with them throughout the whole building. The guy broke the door in the kitchen. His stuff to break the door was there on the ground. The police couldn't really do much. I don't even know if they found the guy. Later that day, we heard that they were riding around the building 2 hours before the guy went in, and the guy had walked all over the ground floor, all while we were having our coffee on the second floor. That's a pretty scary thought. The next day, I had one more night shift. Though I don't have that much to fear, it was still pretty scary. So I asked if I could bring my 2 dogs. We had 2 golden at the time, and they were actually okay with that. So I brought them with me the next night. Nothing happened. The dogs walked with me the whole night, and of course, I let them outside now and then to do their thing. The other night, 2 other colleagues had the night shift, and guess what? They came back. They had robbed the safe. I always thought that the guy we had was just looking around to see if he could get away, but they had planned to come back for the safe the next night. But I'm guessing the 2 golden scared them off. I wouldn't go inside if there were 2 dogs like that either if I didn't know them. Later on, I always brought my dogs if I ever did the night shift over there. Most colleagues would be happy if they worked with me because they felt safe with the dogs, and so did I. The funny thing was that the dogs knew the route we always walked. After a few times, I didn't even put their leash on, they just knew. If we needed to help a client, they just waited in the hallway until I was done. A few clients knew it because I told them, knowing that they loved dogs. So when they needed our help, the dogs went with us in their apartment. Both the dogs and clients loved that.